Hey everyone, I'm Peter Stories, here to guide you today. If you use this video to drift off to sleep, please tap like, hit subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now settle in, get cozy, and let yourself relax. My name is Thomas Davis, and I am 32 years old. This happened in Tate's Hell State Forest, Florida, during what was supposed to be a weekend of peaceful solitude to clear my head. If I had known what was waiting for me there, I would have checked into a hotel and drowned my sorrows in minibar vodka instead. The divorce papers had been finalized just 3 days before. Karen took the house, the car, and most of our friends in the settlement. All I had left was my camping gear and a desperate need to escape. My therapist had suggested reconnecting with nature might help process my grief, so Tate's Hell seemed as good a place as any to disappear for a while. Named for a pioneer who got lost in its swamps in 1875, claiming, "I just came from hell." When he emerged days later, the forest has always had a reputation for disorienting travelers. It's a vast expanse of cypress swamps and pine flatwoods sprawling across more than 200,000 acres in Florida's panhandle. I'd read about its eerie dwarf cypress trees, stunted by the acidic soil, creating an otherworldly landscape perfect for getting lost, both literally and figuratively. I arrived late Thursday afternoon, parking my truck at the New River Campground, one of the few established sites in the forest. The October air had a slight chill, unusual for Florida but welcome after the suffocating summer heat. The campground was nearly empty, just a couple of RVs parked at the far end. Perfect. The last thing I wanted was small talk with cheerful families. The ranger who checked me in, a weathered man in his 60s named Bill, raised an eyebrow when I mentioned I planned to hike deeper into the forest for primitive camping. "You planning on going alone?" he asked, studying my face. "That's the idea," I replied, trying to sound more confident than I felt. Karen had always been the better navigator between us. Bill's eyes narrowed. "Stick to the marked trails if you do. Had 3 hikers go missing last month. Found 2 of them eventually, but they weren't making much sense when we did. Third one's still out there somewhere." I nodded, only half listening as he pointed out trails on my map. My mind was too crowded with thoughts of Karen, of her voice when she told me she hadn't loved me for years, of the look in her eyes when she said she'd been seeing someone else since last Christmas. "And whatever you do," Bill continued, his voice dropping lower, "if you hear someone calling your name who ain't supposed to be there, don't answer, and don't follow." That got my attention. "What do you mean?" He waved his hand dismissively. "Just local superstition. You know how these old forests get their stories." Then he stamped my permit and sent me on my way with a final warning about the possibility of rain. I started down the High Bluff Coastal Trail, planning to set up camp near Whiskey George Creek. The trail wound through stands of longleaf pine, their needles whispering overhead as the wind picked up. The weight of my pack and the rhythm of my boots on the sandy soil gradually worked their magic, and for brief moments, I could focus on something other than my failed marriage. As the sun began to sink lower, I found a small clearing about 50 yards from the creek. It was farther from water than ideal, but something about the spot near the creek felt wrong. Too exposed, maybe, or too close to the swampy sections where the ground never quite dried. I set up my tent, collected firewood, and managed to get a decent blaze going before darkness fell completely. As I sat by the fire eating my dehydrated beef stew, I realized this was my first meal alone in nearly 8 years. Karen and I had met in college, moved in together after graduation, and married a year later. We'd been inseparable until we weren't. Night descended quickly in the forest, bringing with it a symphony of sounds: crickets, frogs, the occasional hoot of an owl. The darkness between the trees was absolute, held at bay only by my small fire. For the first time in months, I felt something like peace. Then I heard someone call my name. Thomas. It was faint, barely audible over the crackling of the fire. I froze, spoon halfway to my mouth, listening intently. Had I imagined it? Thomas. There it was again, slightly louder this time. A woman's voice coming from the direction of the creek. It wasn't Karen's voice. I knew hers better than my own, but it was similar enough to make my heart lurch. "Hello?" I called, setting down my dinner and reaching for my flashlight. "Is someone there?" Silence answered me. I should have remembered Bill's warning. I should have stayed put. But exhaustion and emotional turmoil had worn down my better judgment, and curiosity pulled me to my feet. I grabbed my flashlight and followed the beam toward the creek, sweeping it back and forth across the undergrowth. "Hello? Do you need help?" Nothing but the normal sounds of the forest. I was beginning to think I had imagined the voice when I reached the creek's edge. Whiskey George Creek was wider than I'd expected, perhaps 20 feet across at this point, its black water moving slowly beneath the moonlight. The cypress trees along its banks were haunting silhouettes, their knees protruding from the water like the fingers of drowning giants. As I stood there, the beam of my flashlight reflecting off the dark water, I noticed something odd about my reflection. It seemed delayed, moving a fraction of a second after I did. And there was something wrong with my eyes. They looked too wide, too dark. I leaned closer and my reflection smiled when I didn't. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping my flashlight. My heart hammered against my ribs as I scrambled away from the creek edge, branches whipping at my face as I ran blindly back toward my campsite. The fire had died down to embers, casting long shadows that seemed to reach for me as I burst into the clearing. I threw more wood onto the coals, hands shaking so badly I could barely manage the task. As the flames grew higher, I told myself I'd been seeing things. A trick of the moonlight on the water, combined with exhaustion and emotional stress. But I couldn't shake the memory of that smile, the way it had stretched too wide across my reflection's face. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I started to drift off, some sound would jerk me awake. A branch breaking, leaves rustling too close to my tent, or worst of all, what sounded like footsteps circling my campsite. When dawn finally broke, I was sitting upright in my sleeping bag, knife in hand, eyes burning from lack of sleep. Morning brought rationality with its light. I convinced myself I'd let the ranger's warning get to me, creating phantoms where there were none. I made coffee on my portable stove, its familiar ritual soothing my frayed nerves. As the caffeine hit my system, I decided to stay another night. I wouldn't let one bad experience ruin my trip. Karen had taken enough from me already. I spent the day hiking, pushing myself physically to exhaust the nervous energy that had built up overnight. I followed the trail north toward the Ralph G. Kendrick Dwarf Cypress Boardwalk, where the trees grew no taller than 15 feet despite being centuries old. There was something deeply unsettling about walking among them, like being watched by ancient, stunted beings. As I walked back to camp in the late afternoon, the sky darkened with gathering storm clouds. The wind picked up, and I quickened my pace, hoping to beat the rain. I was about a mile from my campsite when the first drops began to fall. By the time I reached my tent, the rain was coming down in sheets. I ducked inside, grateful for the waterproof fabric as the storm raged around me. Thunder boomed overhead, and lightning illuminated the forest in stark flashes of brilliance. During one such flash, I saw a silhouette standing just outside my tent, a human figure, motionless in the downpour. "Hello?" I called out, my voice nearly lost in the rumble of thunder that followed. Nothing. I fumbled for my flashlight, cursing when I couldn't immediately find it. When I finally got it on and pointed it toward the tent entrance, there was no one there. I unzipped the tent with trembling fingers and swept the beam around my campsite. The rain was falling in such heavy sheets that visibility was limited to a few feet, but I could see no one. I zipped the tent closed again and sat in the center of my sleeping bag, flashlight clutched tightly in my hand. The storm continued for hours, the wind threatening to tear my tent from its stakes several times. All the while, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was out there, watching and waiting. When the storm finally passed around midnight, an unnatural silence fell over the forest. No frogs, no insects, no night birds, just the occasional drip of water from saturated leaves. I strained my ears, listening for any sound that might indicate I wasn't alone. Thomas. The voice came from right outside my tent, so close it could have been whispering in my ear. I bit back a scream, scrambling backward until I hit the far side of the tent. "Who's there?" I demanded, voice cracking. "Thomas, help me. I'm lost." It was the same voice from the night before. Female, plaintive, with an echo-like quality that made it hard to pinpoint its origin. Despite my terror, something about it compelled me to respond. "Who are you?" "Help me find my way back, Thomas, like you promised." I never made any such promise. I grabbed my knife again, holding it in one hand and my flashlight in the other. "Go away. Leave me alone." A sound came then, halfway between a laugh and a sob, before silence fell again. I sat rigid, listening for any movement outside, but heard nothing. After what felt like hours, exhaustion won out over fear, and I fell into a fitful sleep filled with dreams of dark water and reflections that moved on their own. I woke to sunlight filtering through my tent and birds singing as if nothing had happened. For a brief, blessed moment, I thought perhaps I had dreamed the entire encounter. Then I saw the footprints. They circled my tent, dozens of barefoot impressions in the mud, small like a woman's or a child's, but with toes that seemed too long, too pointed. They approached from the direction of the creek, circled my tent countless times, and then led away again. I packed my gear with shaking hands, abandoning any pretense of enjoying my weekend in nature. All I wanted now was to get back to my truck and put as much distance between myself and Tate's hell as possible. As I shouldered my pack and prepared to leave, I noticed something hanging from a nearby branch that hadn't been there before. A crude doll made of twigs and moss, bound with what looked disturbingly like human hair. Dark red stains marked the place where a face would be. I left it there, practically running down the trail back toward the campground. My mind raced with explanations. Local kids playing pranks, another camper with a sick sense of humor, my own fragile mental state manifesting in bizarre ways. The hike back should have taken 2 hours at most. After 3 hours of walking, I realized I should have reached the campground already. The trail markers I'd been following seemed to be taking me in circles, bringing me back to the same lightning-struck pine tree I'd passed twice before. My phone had no signal, and when I checked my compass, the needle spun wildly, unable to find north. Panic began to set in as I realized I was lost, genuinely lost, in a forest known for swallowing people whole. "Are you lost, Thomas?" I whirled around, nearly losing my balance. Standing about 20 yards away was a woman, petite, with long, dark hair that hung in wet ropes around a pale face. She wore what might have once been a white dress, now gray with dirt and green with algae or moss. Water seemed to drip constantly from her clothes and hair, though the ground around her remained dry. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice hoarse with fear. She tilted her head at an unnatural angle. "Don't you recognize me? You did last night." "I don't know you." I took a step backward, tightening my grip on my walking stick. She smiled then, her lips stretching too wide across her face, revealing teeth that were jagged and green with decay. "But I know you, Thomas Davis. I know everything about you." Before I could respond, she was gone, not running away or fading from view, but simply there one moment and gone the next, like a television switched off. I ran blindly then, abandoning the trail and crashing through underbrush, branches clawing at my face and arms. I had no direction in mind except away from her, away from that smile that would haunt me for the rest of my life. I don't know how long I ran before the ground beneath me suddenly gave way. One moment I was sprinting through pine flatwoods, and the next I was falling, tumbling down a steep embankment I hadn't seen. My pack caught on something, wrenching my shoulder painfully as I continued to fall, finally coming to rest at the edge of a small sinkhole filled with muddy water. The impact knocked the wind from my lungs. As I lay there gasping, I realized I'd lost my walking stick and my water bottle in the fall. My map was in my pack, which was now dangling from a tree root halfway up the embankment. I tried to stand, but a sharp pain shot through my ankle when I put weight on it. Not broken, I didn't think, but badly sprained. I crawled to a nearby tree and used it to pull myself upright, balancing on my good foot. It was then that I heard the splashing. Something was moving in the sinkhole, disturbing the muddy water in rhythmic patterns like someone walking slowly toward the edge where I stood. But there was nothing visible breaking the surface. I hobbled away as quickly as my injured ankle would allow, using trees for support. The forest seemed to close in around me, the spaces between trees narrowing, the ground becoming increasingly boggy as I moved deeper into what I realized must be one of the swampy areas marked as dangerous on my now unreachable map. By late afternoon, I was exhausted, dehydrated, and hopelessly lost. The swamp had given way to slightly higher ground with more pines than cypress, but I had no idea if I was heading toward or away from the campground. My ankle had swollen to twice its normal size, and each step sent waves of pain up my leg. As the light began to fade, I knew I needed to find shelter for the night. Without my pack, I had no tent, no sleeping bag, and no food. All I had was the knife on my belt, a lighter in my pocket, and the clothes on my back. I managed to gather enough dry wood to build a small fire, using a depression beneath a fallen tree as a windbreak. As darkness fell, I huddled close to the flames, jumping at every sound from the surrounding forest. The temperature dropped sharply after sunset, and I shivered in my thin jacket, holding my hands out to the fire. My stomach growled with hunger, and my mouth felt like sandpaper from thirst. I knew I could last a few days without food, but water would become critical by morning. I must have dozed off despite my best efforts to stay awake because I jerked back to consciousness at the sound of something heavy moving through the underbrush nearby. My fire had died down to embers, casting just enough light to see that I was surrounded by dense darkness. "Hello?" I called, my voice weak and cracking. "Is anyone there?" The movement stopped. Then, from the darkness beyond my dying fire, I heard a wet, gurgling sound, like someone trying to speak with lungs full of water. I grabbed a burning branch from the fire, holding it out like a torch. The flickering light revealed nothing at first, and then movement. Something pale shifting between the trees about 15 feet away. "Show yourself," I demanded, trying to sound braver than I felt. The pale shape moved closer, resolving into the figure of the woman I'd seen earlier. In the firelight, I could see her more clearly, the blue tinge to her lips, the way her skin seemed to hang too loosely on her frame, the dark hollows where her eyes should be. Water dripped constantly from her hair and clothes, forming a puddle at her feet that never seemed to grow larger. "Thomas," she said, and her voice was clearer now, almost normal except for the slight burbling quality underneath. "You should have answered me the first time I called." "What do you want from me?" I asked, the burning branch trembling in my hand. She took another step closer, and I could smell her now, the stench of stagnant water and decay. "Company," she whispered. "It gets so lonely down there." "Down where?" Her smile widened impossibly, splitting her face almost to the ears. "In the water, Thomas, where I've been waiting since Elizabeth pushed me in." I didn't know any Elizabeth, had no idea what she was talking about, but cold terror crept up my spine as she took another step toward me. The fire hissed and steamed where the water dripping from her dress hit the embers. "You have her eyes," the woman continued, her head tilting at that unnatural angle again. "The same eyes that watched me drown. She held me under, you know, her own sister." "I'm not related to you," I said, backing away slowly. "My name is Thomas Davis. I'm from Tampa. I don't know anyone named Elizabeth." The woman paused, her head straightening slowly. "Davis?" she repeated, confusion crossing her waterlogged features. Not Anderson? No, I said, seizing on her uncertainty. You have the wrong person. I'm not who you're looking for. For a long moment, she stood motionless, water dripping steadily from her outstretched fingertips. Then, her face contorted with rage, the skin splitting in places to reveal something dark and writhing underneath. "Liar!" she shrieked, the sound echoing through the forest like metal tearing. "You all lie! He said he'd come back for me too." She lunged forward with impossible speed. I swung the burning branch in a wide arc, connecting with her shoulder. There was a hissing sound like water hitting hot metal, and she recoiled, a scream tearing from her throat that sounded like nothing human. I didn't wait to see more. I turned and ran, ignoring the agony in my ankle, driven by pure adrenaline and terror. Branches whipped at my face, roots seemed to reach up to trip me, but I kept moving, putting as much distance between myself and that thing as possible. I don't know how long I ran before I saw lights through the trees ahead, artificial lights, steady and bright. Hope surged through me as I forced myself toward them, nearly sobbing with relief when I broke through the tree line and saw the ranger station at the edge of a paved road. I collapsed on the doorstep, pounding on the door with the last of my strength. When Bill the ranger opened it, the look of shock on his face told me I must have been a sight. Clothes torn and muddy, face scratched and bleeding, eyes wild with fear. "Jesus Christ, son," he muttered, helping me inside. "What happened to you?" I tried to explain through chattering teeth about the voice, the woman, the footprints, but my words came out jumbled and incoherent. Bill sat me down, wrapped a blanket around my shoulders, and pressed a mug of hot coffee into my trembling hands. "Slow down," he said gently. "Take a breath." When I was calmer, I told him everything, starting with the voice calling my name and ending with my desperate flight through the dark forest. He listened without interrupting, his weathered face growing increasingly grim. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment, staring into his own coffee mug as if it held answers. "You said she thought your name was Anderson?" he finally asked. I nodded. She seemed confused when I told her it was Davis. Bill sighed heavily, setting down his mug. "About 30 years ago, there was a man named James Anderson who used to come fishing in these parts. Local girl fell in love with him. Margaret Sullivan was her name. He promised to take her away from here, marry her. Then one day, he just stopped coming. Word got back eventually that he already had a wife in Tallahassee." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with my wet clothes. "Margaret couldn't handle it," Bill continued. "Walked into Whiskey George Creek one night and never came out. They found her body 3 days later, caught in the cypress knees downriver." "And you think—" I couldn't finish the sentence. Bill shrugged. "I think Tate's Hell has a way of finding what hurts you most and using it against you. You said you're going through a divorce. Heart full of pain about a woman who left you?" I nodded numbly. "Margaret's been spotted over the years," he said matter-of-factly, as if discussing the weather. "Always going after men who remind her of the one who broke her heart. Usually she just scares them. You're lucky." "Why didn't you warn me?" I demanded, anger momentarily overriding my fear. "Would you have believed me?" Bill countered. "If I'd told you there was a vengeful ghost in the forest who might mistake you for her long-dead lover, would you have turned around and gone home?" He had a point. I would have thought him crazy or assumed he was trying to scare off tourists. Bill insisted I go to the hospital to have my ankle checked out, and he drove me there himself in his ranger truck. As we pulled away from the station, I looked back at the dark line of trees that mark the edge of Tate's Hell State Forest. For just a moment, I thought I saw a pale figure among the cypress trees. A woman in a dirty white dress, water dripping from her hair, watching us drive away with hollow, hungry eyes. The doctors at the small regional hospital treated my ankle, cleaned the cuts on my face and arms, and diagnosed me with mild dehydration. They wanted to keep me overnight for observation, concerned about my disjointed speech and apparent hallucinations. I didn't argue. The sterile hospital room with its bright fluorescent lighting was the safest I'd felt in days. That night, I dreamed of dark water and a woman's voice calling my name. In the dream, I was standing at the edge of Whiskey George Creek, and my reflection was smiling up at me, beckoning me closer. As I leaned forward, hands reached up from the water, pale, bloated hands with elongated fingers that grabbed my wrists and began to pull. I woke with a start, heart racing. The clock on the wall showed 3:17 a.m. The room was quiet except for the steady beep of the monitor I was connected to. As my pulse slowed, I noticed something odd. A puddle of water on the floor beside my bed, leading to the closed bathroom door. And from behind that door came the soft sound of a woman humming. I lunged for the call button, pressing it repeatedly until a sleepy-eyed nurse appeared in the doorway. By then, the humming had stopped, and when she checked the bathroom at my frantic insistence, it was empty and dry. They discharged me the next morning with a prescription for anti-anxiety medication and a referral to a therapist. Bill picked me up and drove me back to the New River campground where my truck was still parked. During the drive, neither of us mentioned what had happened in the forest. What was there to say that wouldn't sound completely insane in the daylight? As I climbed into my truck, Bill handed me a small cloth bag that smelled strongly of herbs and something else I couldn't identify. "Old Seminole protection," he explained gruffly. "Hang it from your rearview mirror until you're well clear of this county." I took it without question, thanked him, and started the long drive back to Tampa, the strange sachet swinging gently from my mirror. I've moved since then, left Florida entirely for a small apartment in North Carolina, as far from any swamps or cypress trees as I could manage. I've started seeing a therapist twice a week, who believes my experience was a stress-induced psychotic episode triggered by the trauma of my divorce. Maybe she's right, maybe it was all in my head, but sometimes when I'm in the shower or washing dishes, I'll catch a glimpse of my reflection in the water, and for just a split second, it seems to move a moment after I do. And on rainy nights, when water drips steadily from the eaves outside my window, I swear I can hear a woman's voice calling my name, asking me to help her find her way back, like I promised. My name is William Brown, and I am 34 years old. This happened in Tate's Hell State Forest, Florida, during what was supposed to be a rejuvenating solo camping trip after my divorce. I'd never been much of an outdoorsman, but something about the idea of being alone with my thoughts in the wilderness appealed to me. I needed space from the rubble of my failed marriage, from the pitying looks of friends, from the suffocating emptiness of the apartment Sarah had left behind. I chose Tate's Hell because of its name, if I'm being honest. There was something poetic about walking into hell after the year I'd had. The irony appealed to my bitter sense of humor. I'd read about the legend, how a farmer named C.B. Tate had wandered into the swamp in 1875 looking for a panther that had killed his livestock, only to emerge days later, delirious and dying, declaring he'd just came from hell. I figured any place with a story like that would give me the solitude I craved. It was early October, and the summer heat had finally released its grip on northern Florida. I parked my car at a small lot near the High Bluff Coastal Hiking Trail, shouldered my pack, and set off down the trail. The weight felt good, tangible, purposeful. Everything I needed was on my back. Tent, sleeping bag, water filter, food for 5 days, first aid kit, and my grandfather's hunting knife, more for sentiment than protection. The first few hours were peaceful. The trail wound through cypress domes and pine flatwoods, occasionally opening to reveal vast stretches of dwarf cypress trees, stunted, twisted things that looked ancient and wise. Wildlife was abundant. I spotted herons stalking through shallow waters, turtles sunning themselves on logs, and once the unmistakable ripple of an alligator gliding through dark water. By late afternoon, I'd reached my intended campsite near New River. I set up my tent on a small rise, safe from potential flooding, and collected wood for a fire. As I worked, I listened to the forest sounds, a chorus of insects, the occasional splash in the water, birds calling to each other across the canopy. For the first time in months, I felt the knot in my chest loosen slightly. Night fell quickly in the forest. I sat by my small fire, watching sparks rise into the darkness, eating a simple meal of rehydrated stew. The stars emerged, impossibly bright away from city lights. I felt small beneath them, and somehow, that feeling was comforting. My problem seemed less significant under that vast sky. I was just about to turn in when I heard it. A soft, rhythmic sound in the darkness beyond my fire's glow. Thump, thump, thump. Like footsteps, but too regular, too mechanical. I strained my eyes, scanning the darkness, but saw nothing. "Hello," I called, immediately feeling foolish. I was miles from the nearest campsite. No one should be out here. The sound stopped. I told myself it was an animal, perhaps a deer stepping cautiously through the underbrush. Or maybe it was just the shifting of cooling wood in my fire. I crawled into my tent, zipped myself into my sleeping bag, and tried to sleep. Dreams came quickly, vivid and unsettling. I was running through endless swampland, water pulling at my legs, something dark and formless pursuing me. I couldn't see it, but I could feel its breath on my neck, hear the wet slap of its movement through the water behind me. I woke with a gasp, sweat-soaked despite the cool night air. The thumping was back. Closer now. Thump, thump, thump. I fumbled for my headlamp, clicked it on. The tent walls glowed, thin barriers between me and whatever waited outside. I held my breath, listening. The thumping stopped again, replaced by new sound. A low, continuous dragging noise like something heavy being pulled across the forest floor. "Who's there?" I called, my voice cracking slightly. No response, just the dragging sound, circling my tent now. Once, twice, 3 times. Then silence. I lay frozen in my sleeping bag, eyes wide, ears straining. Nothing, just the normal nighttime forest sounds. Eventually, exhaustion overcame fear, and I drifted back to sleep. Dawn broke gray and misty. I unzipped my tent and stepped out, half expecting to see signs of my nighttime visitor. But the clearing looked undisturbed, save for a few fallen branches near where I'd heard the dragging sound. I must have been dreaming, I told myself. Or perhaps a curious animal had investigated my camp. I made coffee on my small camp stove, watching steam rise into the cool morning air. The rational part of my brain insisted last night's fears were just imagination, the product of unfamiliar surroundings and lingering stress. But something deeper, more primitive, whispered caution. I decided to hike to Ralph G. Kendrick Dwarf Cypress Boardwalk that day. The trail wasn't difficult, winding through marshland and pine forest. The raised wooden boardwalk offered views of the uniquely beautiful dwarf cypress swamp, trees shaped by harsh conditions into natural bonsai forms, none taller than 15 feet despite being centuries old. Standing on the boardwalk, surrounded by these ancient, twisted trees rising from tea-colored water, I felt a strange sense of being watched. I scanned the swamp, looking for wildlife, but saw nothing besides the occasional bird. Still, the feeling persisted, crawling up my spine like cold fingers. Mid-afternoon, I headed back to camp. The strange feelings from the morning had mostly dissipated under the warm sun and physical exertion. I was looking forward to another evening by the fire, perhaps reading one of the paperbacks I'd brought. I was about a mile from my campsite when I first noticed something odd about the trail. Footprints, not mine, pressed into the soft earth. They were barefoot, unusually large, with toes that seemed too long and widely splayed. They followed my trail back toward camp. I stopped, heart suddenly hammering. Who else was out here? And why would they be barefoot in this terrain with its sharp cypress knees and occasional snakes? "Hello?" I called again, louder this time. My voice echoed through the trees, unanswered. I continued cautiously, one hand resting on the handle of my grandfather's knife. The footprints continued all the way to my camp, circled my tent, just as the dragging sound had circled it last night, and then disappeared into the marsh toward New River. My campsite looked untouched. Tent still standing, pack still hanging from a tree branch where I'd left it. But something felt wrong. I approached slowly, unzipped the tent, peered inside. Everything was exactly as I'd left it, except for one thing. Centered perfectly on my sleeping bag was a small, crude doll made of twisted cypress twigs and Spanish moss. Its head was a small knot of wood with 2 holes bored into it like eyes, and its body was bound with what looked like human hair, dark brown, like mine. I backed out of the tent, pulse racing. This was no animal. Someone was messing with me. Maybe local kids who'd seen me arrive, playing a sick joke on the city boy camping alone. Or perhaps another hiker with a warped sense of humor. "Very funny," I shouted, anger temporarily overriding fear. "Real mature." Only the indifferent forest answered me. I considered packing up and leaving, but pride and stubborn determination kept me there. I wouldn't be chased off by some prankster. Instead, I took the doll, walked to the edge of camp, and hurled it as far as I could into the swamp. I heard a distant splash. That night, I built my fire larger than necessary, the flames a bulwark against the darkness. I positioned myself where I could see the approaches to my camp and kept my knife within easy reach. For hours, I sat watching, listening, jumping at every crack of burning wood and rustle of leaves. Nothing came. The night passed uneventfully, and I eventually crawled into my tent, exhausted but relieved. Perhaps whoever had left the doll had had their fun and moved on. I was wrong. I woke to the sound of water dripping inside my tent. Drip, 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 right above my face. I opened my eyes, confused. My tent wasn't leaking. The weather had been dry. The dripping sound continued, rhythmic and persistent. I turned on my headlamp. The twig doll hung from my tent ceiling, suspended by a strand of what looked like fishing line. It was soaking wet, water dripping from its crude limbs onto my face. And now, in addition to the hair binding its body, it wore a strip of fabric that I recognized with sickening clarity. A piece torn from the shirt I'd been wearing yesterday. I scrambled out of my sleeping bag, out of the tent, into the gray pre-dawn light. Standing in the clearing in my thermals, breath coming in short gasps, I realized I was not alone here. Someone had entered my tent while I slept, had stood over me, had cut a piece from my clothing. This was no prank. This was something else entirely. I packed my gear with trembling hands, constantly scanning the tree line. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming now, a physical pressure on my skin. I needed to get out of here, back to my car, back to civilization. But as I shouldered my pack and turned toward the trail, I realized with dawning horror that I wasn't sure which way to go. The trail I'd followed in, clearly marked, well-trodden, was gone. In its place were dozens of identical-looking paths leading into the swamp, none of them familiar. I pulled out my phone, hoping to use the GPS, but there was no signal. My compass, reliable yesterday, now spun aimlessly, the needle rotating in complete circles as if confused. Something was very wrong in Tate's hell. I chose a path that seemed to head in the right direction and started walking. The forest had changed overnight. The friendly, open woodland of yesterday had transformed into a claustrophobic tangle of vegetation. Cypress knees jutted from the ground like bony fingers. Spanish moss hung in thick curtains, brushing against my face with damp, grasping tendrils. The ground became increasingly soggy, water seeping into my boots. After an hour of walking, I should have reached the main trail. Instead, I found myself in unfamiliar terrain, deeper in the swamp than before. The sun, what little I could see of it through the canopy, seemed to be in the wrong position. Either I'd gotten completely turned around or time itself was behaving strangely here. The panic I'd been suppressing threatened to overwhelm me. I stopped, forced myself to breathe deeply, to think. I needed to find flowing water. New River or one of its tributaries. Water would lead to the coast eventually. I listened carefully and thought I detected the faint sound of moving water to my left. I turned that way, pushing through dense vegetation. The sound grew louder. not the gentle burble of a river, but a rhythmic splashing, as if something large was moving through shallow water. Thump, splash, thump, splash. The footsteps from the night before. I froze, suddenly aware of movement ahead, partially obscured by hanging moss and cypress branches. Something tall was moving through the swamp water, its form indistinct in the filtered green light. It moved with purpose, with awareness. It moved like a person, but wrong. Too fluid, too tall, limbs articulating at impossible angles. I crouched down, trying to make myself invisible among the cypress knees. The figure paused as if sensing my presence. It turned slowly, and though I couldn't make out its features clearly through the hanging moss, I felt its gaze lock onto mine. A low, rattling sound emerged from it. Not quite a growl, not quite a laugh. Then it began moving toward me, picking up speed, water splashing higher with each step. I ran. I crashed through the underbrush, no longer caring about direction, only about putting distance between myself and whatever was pursuing me. Branches whipped at my face, roots threatened to trip me, but terror kept me upright and moving. The splashing sounds followed, growing neither closer nor more distant. My pursuer was matching my pace exactly, herding me rather than hunting me. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs threatened to give out. When I could go no farther, I collapsed against the trunk of a massive cypress, gasping for breath. The splashing had stopped. I strained my ears but heard only my own ragged breathing and the background sounds of the swamp. Had I lost it? Or was it simply waiting, watching? As my breathing slowed, I became aware of something carved into the trunk of the cypress tree I was leaning against. Letters, crude but readable, spelled out a name. Eliza Wade. Below it were more names, dozens of them, carved into the ancient bark at different heights, in different hands. Some looked decades old, the edges of the letters smoothed by time and weather. Others appeared fresher, the exposed wood still pale. At the bottom, newest of all, was a final name, William Brown. My name, carved into the tree, waiting for me. A scream built in my throat, but before it could escape, something moved in my peripheral vision. I turned to see a woman standing 50 yards away, partially hidden by a cypress trunk. She wore what looked like a long, old-fashioned dress, dark with moisture at the hem. Her hair hung in lank strands around a pale face. She was watching me intently. "Hello?" I called, voice shaking. "Can you help me? I'm lost." The woman didn't respond. She remained motionless, watching. Then, slowly, she raised one arm and beckoned to me, inviting me to follow before turning and walking deeper into the swamp. "Wait," I called. Despite my fear, the thought of following this strange woman seemed marginally better than remaining alone with the carved names and whatever had been pursuing me. "Who are you?" She paused, looked back over her shoulder. This time, I could see her face more clearly. Her eyes were wrong, entirely black, no whites visible, and her mouth stretched too wide across her face. As I watched, horrified, her neck elongated, twisting at an impossible angle to keep her face turned toward me while her body faced away. This was no woman. The thing that wasn't a woman smiled, revealing rows of needle-like teeth, then resumed walking away, clearly expecting me to follow. I scrambled to my feet and ran in the opposite direction. Hours blended together as I stumbled through the swamp. The light never seemed to change. A perpetual green twilight filtered through moss and leaves. My water ran out. Hunger gnawed at my stomach. Still, I pushed on, desperate to find a way out or at least a recognizable landmark. I saw the not woman several more times, always at a distance, always watching, always beckoning. Sometimes she appeared as I'd first seen her. Other times she manifested as a young girl in muddy overalls, or an elderly man with a fishing pole. But the eyes were always the same, black pools without bottom, and the smile always too wide, too full of needle teeth. As night fell, or what I assumed was night, as the green twilight darkened to gray, I found myself in a small clearing. Too exhausted to continue, I collapsed at the base of a tree, not even bothering to set up my tent. I would rest, just for a little while, then continue my search for a way out. Sleep came instantly, and with it, dreams. I dreamed of Sarah, of our final argument, voices raised in our kitchen as years of resentment finally boiled over. I dreamed of her walking away, suitcase in hand, not looking back. I dreamed of the emptiness she left behind, the silence that filled our home like a physical presence. Then the dream shifted. I was back in Tate's hell, but in a part I hadn't seen before. A small cabin stood in a clearing, lantern light glowing warmly through its windows. Through an open door, I could see a woman in an old-fashioned dress stirring something in a pot over a fire. She looked up, saw me watching, and smiled. A normal human smile, welcoming and kind. "Come in out of the night, William," she called, her voice melodic and soothing. "It's not safe out there after dark." In the dream, I stepped toward the cabin, drawn by the light and warmth, by the promise of safety and human contact. As I crossed the threshold, the woman turned to face me fully. Her eyes were Sarah's eyes, but her face began to change, features melting and reforming into something inhuman, that too wide smile spreading across what was no longer a face. "You've come to hell, William," the thing said in Sarah's voice. "Just like Seabay Tate, just like all the others." It gestured to the corner of the cabin where a pile of human bones lay heaped, some still draped with rotting clothing. "And like them, you'll never leave." I woke with a scream trapped in my throat, the dream fading, but the terror lingering. It took me a moment to realize I wasn't alone in the clearing. Standing in a semicircle around me were 5 figures, human-shaped but wrong in fundamental ways. Their proportions were distorted, limbs too long, joints bending in unnatural directions. They were nude but sexless, their skin a mottled gray-green that blended with the swamp colors. Where faces should have been were smooth, featureless expanses of skin, interrupted only by black, pit-like eyes. They stood perfectly still, watching me, waiting. Behind them stood the Not Woman, now in the form of the old man with the fishing pole. It smiled that needle-toothed smile and nodded, as if confirming something. "What do you want?" I whispered, voice barely functioning. The faceless figures began to move then, not toward me but around me, a slow dance that gradually tightened the circle. Their movements were fluid, graceful despite their wrongness. As they moved, they began to change, their featureless faces rippling, features emerging. My features, 5 identical copies of my face, expressions frozen in terror. The Not Woman spoke then, its voice a dry rustling like dead leaves. "They want what was promised, William Brown. They want you to join them, to become part of Tate's hell, as was foretold." "I promise nothing," I said, finding my voice. "I just came here to camp, to be alone." "You were called here," the thing said. "Your name has been waiting on the tree for generations. Your blood belongs to the swamp now." As if responding to its words, the 5 figures lunged forward simultaneously. I felt cold, damp hands grasp my arms, my legs, my throat. I struggled, kicking and thrashing, but their grip was implacable. They began to drag me across the clearing toward a dark pool of water I hadn't noticed before. With desperate strength born of terror, I managed to free one hand. I reached for my grandfather's knife, still sheathed at my belt, and slashed wildly. The blade connected with something solid. There was no blood, but one of the creatures recoiled, a deep gash across its William face, revealing not bone or tissue but twisted wood and moss beneath the skin-like exterior. The others hesitated, and in that moment of confusion, I broke free. I ran, knife still clutched in my hand, crashing through the underbrush without direction or purpose. Only the blind animal need to escape. Behind me, I heard the rustling voice of the Not Woman. "Run, William Brown. The swamp knows your name now. It will find you." Dawn found me still running, though my pace had slowed to a stumbling walk. My clothes were torn, my skin scratched and bleeding from countless branches and thorns. Thirst burned my throat, and hunger had become a constant companion. But worse than these physical discomforts was the certainty that I was being herded, driven in a specific direction by unseen forces. Periodically, I would glimpse one of the William-faced creatures through the trees, or hear the splash of the Knot Woman moving through shallow water nearby. They never attacked again, merely watched and waited, their presence a constant reminder that I was not escaping, but being guided. Around mid-morning, the trees began to thin. Ahead, I could see sunlight, real sunlight, not the filtered green twilight of the deep swamp. Hope surged through me. Perhaps I was nearing the edge of Tate's hell, finding my way back to civilization. I emerged from the trees onto the shore of a vast, stagnant lake. The water stretched to the horizon, perfectly still, its surface a mirror reflecting the cloudy sky above. In the center of the lake stood a single cypress tree, enormous and ancient, its twisted branches reaching like supplicating arms toward the heavens. At the base of the tree, partially submerged in the still water, was a small structure, a cabin like the one from my dream, but decrepit and listing to one side as if slowly sinking into the lake. Standing on the shore, directly across from me, was C.B. Tate himself, or rather what remained of him. He wore the tattered clothes of a 19th-century farmer, his face gaunt and eyes hollow, skin the gray-green of the swamp creatures. When he opened his mouth to speak, I saw that his tongue had been replaced by a writhing mass of roots or tendrils. "You've come," he said, his voice somehow clear despite his grotesque mouth. "The last name on the tree, the final sacrifice." "What are you talking about?" I demanded, knife held out before me, though I knew it would offer little protection. "What sacrifice?" "The swamp demands blood," C.B. said simply. "One soul every generation to keep it satisfied, to keep it contained. My blood bound it for a time, then Eliza Wade's, then all the others whose names you saw carved in the cypress." "And now mine?" I asked, already knowing the answer. C.B. nodded. "You were called here. Your pain, your loneliness. The swamp smelled it on you. It always knows who to call." As he spoke, the water of the lake began to stir. Not ripples, but something moving beneath the surface, something vast. The still mirror of the water bulged upward as something rose from the depths. It emerged slowly, a colossal form composed of twisted roots, rotting vegetation, bones both human and animal, all bound together by living mud that flowed and shifted. At its center, where a heart might be in a human, pulsed a dark mass that emitted a sickly green light. This was the true horror of Tate's hell, not the Knot Woman or the faceless creatures, but this ancient, patient entity that had claimed this swamp as its own. I understood then that the others were merely extensions of its will, puppets created to herd prey toward its maw. "No," I said, backing away. "I won't be your sacrifice." "There is no choice," Sibe said, something like pity in his hollow eyes. "The swamp has marked you. Your name is carved on the tree. There is only one way this ends." As if in response to his words, I felt movement behind me. The 5 William-faced creatures had emerged from the forest, forming a semicircle, cutting off retreat. The Knot Woman stood among them, no longer bothering to maintain a human disguise. Its true form was a shifting amalgamation of all the faces it had shown me, features flowing and merging like wax under heat. I was trapped between them and the monstrosity rising from the lake. In that moment, something snapped inside me. After months of feeling numb following Sarah's departure, of sleepwalking through my own life, real emotion flooded back. Not fear, but rage. Rage at Sarah for leaving, rage at myself for failing, rage at the universe for bringing me to this place, and rage at this ancient evil that thought it could claim me. "No," I said again, louder this time. I raised my grandfather's knife, the blade catching the sunlight. I decide how my story ends. With a cry that contained all my pain and fury, I charged, not at the creatures behind me, but toward the lake, toward the colossal horror rising from its depths. If I was to die here, I would not go meekly into the darkness. I would strike at the heart of the thing that had marked me. I splashed into the water, which was warm and thick, more like oil than water. It clung to my legs, slowing my progress, but I pushed forward, knife raised. Behind me, I heard the rustling voice of the knot woman raised in alarm, the splashing of the creatures as they pursued me into the lake. The monstrosity before me shifted, its mass of roots and bones and mud flowing like a living thing. A cavity opened in its center, a mouth large enough to swallow me whole. From within came the stench of decay and the green glow of that pulsing heart. I was waist-deep in the water now, each step a struggle against the clinging liquid. The creatures were gaining on me, their inhuman limbs better adapted to moving through this medium. I had seconds at most before they reached me. In desperation, I did the only thing I could think of. I threw my knife, aiming for that pulsing green heart at the center of the horror. Time seemed to slow as the blade spun through the air, flashing in the sunlight. For a moment I thought it would fall short or miss its target entirely, but then, impossibly, it struck true, burying itself to the hilt in the glowing mass. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The monstrosity convulsed, its form rippling and distorting. The green glow flared blindingly bright, then began to fade. A sound filled the air. A scream that was not a scream. A roar of pain and rage that seemed to come from the earth itself. Behind me, the William-faced creatures crumpled like puppets with cut strings, collapsing into piles of vegetation and mud. The knot woman wailed, its form losing cohesion, melting into the lake like wax in a flame. The water around me began to churn violently. The dying entity thrashed in its death throes, waves radiating outward from its massive form. I was knocked off my feet, submerged in the thick, warm liquid. I fought to regain the surface, lungs burning, disoriented by the churning water. When I finally broke the surface, gasping for air, the landscape had changed. The vast lake was shrinking, water receding rapidly as if draining through some unseen plug. The colossal horror was gone, as were all its servants. Only C.B. Tate remained, standing on the increasingly exposed lake bed, his form growing more transparent by the second. "What have you done?" he asked, voice fading like a radio losing signal. "The bargain is broken, the swamp is free." Before I could ask what he meant, he dissolved into mist, leaving me alone in what was rapidly becoming a muddy depression rather than a lake. In the center, where the massive entity had been, stood the ancient cypress tree. Real now, not some eldritch horror, and embedded in its trunk was my grandfather's knife, black sap oozing around the blade like blood. I waded through knee-deep mud to retrieve it, sensing that I might need it again before my ordeal was over. As I pulled the blade free, the tree shuddered, a deep groan emanating from its core. Carved into its trunk were names, the same names I'd seen before, with mine at the bottom. But now, a new name was appearing beneath mine, carving itself into the bark without human hands. Sarah Brown. Horror and understanding dawned simultaneously. The swamp entity wasn't dead. It was merely changing tactics. It had sensed my connection to Sarah, was already reaching out to her, calling her as it had called me. I had to warn her. With renewed determination, I turned and began walking in what I hoped was the direction of the trail. To my surprise, I recognized my surroundings now. The twisted landscape of my nightmare had reverted to the normal, natural beauty of Tate's Hell State Forest. In the distance, I could make out a marked trail. It took me hours to reach my car, stumbling along on exhausted legs, clothes caked with drying mud. My hands trembled so badly I could barely get the key into the ignition. But finally, I was driving away from Tate's Hell, cell phone signal gradually returning as I approached civilization. I called Sarah as soon as I had enough bars. When she answered, her voice wary. We hadn't spoken since the divorce. I nearly wept with relief. "Sarah, listen to me," I said, words tumbling out in a desperate rush. "Whatever you do, don't go camping, especially not in Florida. There's something out there, something that knows your name." "Will," she said, confusion and concern in her voice. "Are you okay? You sound—" "Just promise me," I interrupted. "Promise you'll stay away from Tate's Hell State Forest." There was a pause. Then, "It's funny you should mention camping. I've been thinking about taking a trip, getting away for a while. Clear my head. I was looking at places in Florida, actually." My blood ran cold. "Sarah, listen to me. This is going to sound crazy, but something in those woods called me there. It's ancient and evil, and now it's calling you. I think I wounded it, but I didn't kill it, and now it wants you instead of me." Another pause, longer this time. Then Sarah sighed. "Will, I think you need help. This sounds like—" "Just stay away from Florida," I pleaded. "Please, for me." "Okay," she said finally, clearly humoring me. "No Florida camping trips, I promise." I wasn't convinced she believed me. Why would she? Our relationship had ended because I couldn't communicate, couldn't make her understand my thoughts and feelings. Why would she believe this wild tale now? That was 3 weeks ago. I've been staying in a motel since then, afraid to go home, afraid the swamp might somehow reach across the miles to claim me again. I call Sarah every day just to make sure she's safe, that she hasn't suddenly decided to take a trip south. Yesterday, she didn't answer. Today, her phone goes straight to voicemail. I'm driving to her apartment now, praying I'm not too late. Because last night I dreamed of the ancient cypress tree again. My name had been crossed out on its trunk, a deep black line through the letters. But Sarah's name glowed with a sickly green light, pulsing like a heartbeat, calling her to Tate's Hell. And beneath her name, new ones were appearing, carving themselves into the ancient bark. James Anderson, Mary Smith, Robert Johnson, Linda Brown, Michael Williams, Elizabeth Jones. The list continued, hundreds of names, an entire generation marked for sacrifice. I wounded the swamp entity, but in doing so, I may have doomed countless others. Because C.B. Tate was right. The bargain is broken, the swamp is free, and it's hungry. My name is William Brown, and I unleashed hell. My name is James Anderson, and I am 32 years old. This happened in the depths of Blackwater Forest, Florida, just last summer. The humidity hung in the air like a physical presence, clinging to my skin as I shouldered my backpack. The weight of it was reassuring. Food, water, first aid supplies, everything I'd need for my 3-day solo trek through Blackwater Forest. I'd been planning this trip for months, ever since my divorce from Karen had finalized. She'd gotten the house, the car, and most of our friends. I needed to clear my head, reconnect with myself. Blackwater seemed perfect, remote enough that I wouldn't run into weekend warriors, but with established trails I could follow. "You sure about this, man?" my brother had asked when I told him my plan. "Blackwater's pretty isolated. Cell reception is basically non-existent." "That's the point," I'd replied. "I need some time away from everything." What I didn't tell him was how desperate I was for silence. The constant ringing in my ears had started the day Karen left, a high-pitched whine that doctors claimed was stress-induced tinnitus. Sometimes I could swear it formed words, but that was just my mind playing tricks. At least, that's what my therapist said before I stopped going. The trailhead parking lot was empty when I arrived, which suited me fine. I locked my car and checked my GPS one last time before the signal inevitably disappeared. The Blackwater Forest Preserve sprawled across northwestern Florida, a lesser-known cousin to the more famous Apalachicola National Forest. The preserve contained one of the state's few remaining old-growth cypress swamps, surrounded by dense pine forests and riddled with sinkholes and limestone caves. According to local legend, Spanish conquistadors had ventured into these woods centuries ago, searching for gold. Many never returned. Just tourist trap stories, I told myself as I adjusted my backpack straps. The preserve got its name from the tannin-darkened waters of the cypress swamp at its heart. I planned to camp near there on my second night. The trail started innocuously enough, winding through stands of longleaf pine. The afternoon sun filtered through the canopy, creating dappled patterns on the sandy path. My boots crunched rhythmically on fallen pine needles. For the first time in months, the ringing in my ears seemed to quiet. 3 hours in, I reached the first landmark on my map, a limestone outcropping locals called Devil's Pulpit. The formation did resemble a crude lectern, rising from the forest floor like an ancient altar. I paused to drink some water and check my bearings. That's when I first noticed the silence. No birds chirping, no insects buzzing. Just the whisper of wind through the pines and the faint sound of my own breathing. I shrugged it off, probably just a hawk or other predator in the area, sending the smaller creatures into hiding. I continued on, the trail gradually descending into wetter territory. The pines gave way to cypress and tupelo gum trees, their knees protruding from the soggy ground like bony fingers. The air grew thicker, filled with the earthy scent of decomposition and stagnant water. By late afternoon, I reached my first planned campsite, a small clearing on relatively dry ground, close enough to a stream for water, but elevated enough to avoid flooding if it rained. I set up my tent with practiced efficiency, then gathered wood for a small fire. As the light began to fade, I heated water for my freeze-dried meal and sat back against a fallen log, watching flames dance in the growing darkness. That's when the ringing returned, louder than before, a persistent whine that seemed to emanate from the very air around me. I pressed the heels of my hands against my ears, but it did nothing to muffle the sound. If anything, it made it worse, transforming the noise into something almost like words, spoken just below the threshold of comprehension. "Just stress," I muttered to myself. "Just the same old stress?" I tried to focus on my dinner, but the food tasted like ash in my mouth. Night fell quickly in the forest, darkness rushing in like water filling a void. My small fire created a bubble of light that seemed to make the surrounding shadows even deeper. Outside that circle, anything could be watching, and something was watching. I could feel it. I told myself I was being paranoid. Too many horror movies as a kid, too many campfire stories. But the feeling persisted, eyes on me, observing from just beyond the firelight. Occasionally, I caught glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, but whenever I turned to look directly, nothing was there. The ringing in my ears crescendoed, and suddenly, clear as day, I heard a voice within the noise. "James." I jolted upright, scanning the darkness. "Hello?" I called, my voice sounding thin and strained even to my own ears. "Is someone there?" No response, just the crackling of the fire and the endless ringing. I should have packed up then, should have hiked back to my car, even in the dark. But there was nowhere to go. I was hours from the trailhead, and stumbling through Blackwater at night would be suicide. So I did what any rational person would do. I convinced myself it was all in my head. I crawled into my tent shortly after, zipping it shut as if the thin nylon could protect me from whatever lurked in the darkness. Sleep came fitfully, punctuated by dreams of being pursued through endless woods by something I couldn't see but could hear. A wet, shuffling gait and labored breathing that seemed to come from all directions at once. I woke with the dawn, my sleeping bag damp with dew and sweat. The morning light filtering through the trees returned a sense of normalcy to the world. Birds chirped, squirrels chattered, and I almost laughed at my midnight fears. Almost. Because outside my tent, circling the entire campsite, were footprints. Human footprints, but oddly shaped. Too long, too narrow, with toes that seemed more like claws. They formed a perfect circle around my camp, as if someone, or something, had paced around me all night. "Animals," I said aloud, my voice startling in the morning quiet. "Probably just a curious raccoon or something." But raccoons don't leave human-like footprints, and they certainly don't patrol in perfect circles. I packed up quickly, eager to put distance between myself and the campsite. According to my map, I'd reach the heart of the cypress swamp by mid-afternoon if I kept a good pace. Part of me considered turning back, but a stronger part pushed me forward. I'd come here for a reason, and one bizarre night wasn't going to send me running. The trail grew more difficult as I progressed deeper into the preserve. It narrowed, sometimes disappearing entirely beneath standing water. Twice I had to backtrack when I found my path blocked by water too deep to cross safely. The cypresses grew more gnarled and ancient, their massive trunks twisted into shapes that resembled crouching figures or grasping hands. By noon, the sun had disappeared behind a bank of clouds, casting the swamp in gloomy twilight. The air hung motionless, pressing against my skin like a living thing. The ringing in my ears returned, a constant background noise I tried to ignore. I paused at a relatively dry patch to check my map and drink some water. According to my calculations, I should be nearing the center of the preserve. A quarter-mile ahead, there was supposed to be a small island of solid ground, a hammock, Floridians called it, where I planned to make camp. That's when I heard the splash, not the gentle plop of a turtle sliding into water or a fish jumping, but the deliberate sound of something large moving through the swamp. I squinted into the gloom, trying to pinpoint the source. Nothing. Just the endless gray-green of cypress and the black mirror of the water. I shouldered my pack and continued forward, more cautiously now. The splashing came again, closer this time, then again, following me. "Hello," I called. "Someone there?" The response was immediate, a loud splash, as if something had suddenly submerged. Then silence, save for the incessant ringing in my ears. I quickened my pace, no longer caring about keeping my feet dry. Water seeped into my boots as I sloshed along what remained of the trail. The sense of being watched had returned tenfold, and now there was no sunlight to chase away the shadows. When I finally reached the hammock, my relief was short-lived. The small island rose from the swamp like a sanctuary, covered in palmetto and live oak draped with Spanish moss. But something was wrong. The ground was disturbed as if someone, or several someones, had been there recently. And not just passing through, the earth was churned up in places like something had been buried, or dug up. I almost turned back then. Almost. But the thought of trying to navigate the swamp as darkness fell was more terrifying than whatever mysteries the hammock held. Besides, the sky had darkened further, and distant thunder warned of an approaching storm. I made camp quickly, erecting my tent on the highest point of the island. There would be no fire tonight. The wood was too damp, and something in me didn't want to announce my presence any more than necessary. I ate a cold dinner of beef jerky and trail mix, then retreated to my tent as the first fat drops of rain began to fall. The storm hit with sudden ferocity. Wind howled through the cypress, bending them like supplicants before an angry god. Rain lashed against my tent, threatening to tear it from its moorings. I lay in my sleeping bag listening to the cacophony and praying the ancient oaks overhead wouldn't decide to drop their branches on me. In the midst of the storm's fury, the ringing in my ears transformed. No longer just noise, it became a chorus of whispers, dozens of voices speaking just below the threshold of understanding. I pressed my hands against my ears, but the voices only grew louder, more insistent. "James. We know you. We've been waiting." "Shut up," I hissed. "You're not real." But the voices continued, now accompanied by something else, scratching at my tent, like fingernails dragging across the nylon. Tentative at first, then more insistent. "Go away," I shouted, my voice lost in the storm. The scratching stopped, replaced by something worse, the sound of something circling my tent. Heavy footsteps, uneven and dragging, squelching in the rain-soaked ground. Around and around it went, just as the footprints had circled my camp the night before. I lay frozen in terror, tracking the sound as it completed one circuit, then began another. My flashlight beam trembled as I directed it at the tent wall, trying to glimpse whatever lurked outside. The light revealed nothing but the silhouette of rain striking nylon. Then the footsteps stopped, directly in front of my tent's entrance. The zipper there began to move, slowly creeping upward. I lunged forward, grabbing the zipper from inside and yanking it back down. "Who's there?" I yelled. "This isn't funny." The response came not in words but in a low, gurgling growl that raised the hair on my neck. No human made that sound. No animal I knew of either. The zipper jerked upward with sudden force, nearly pulling it from my grasp. I held tight, engaged in a bizarre tug-of-war with whatever waited outside. The nylon around the zipper began to tear. In desperation, I released the zipper and scrambled backward, grabbing my hunting knife from my pack. The zipper shot upward, the tent entrance gaping like a wound in the fabric. But nothing entered. Nothing I could see, at least. Yet the air inside the tent changed, growing colder, seeming to thicken until each breath felt like drowning. The voices in my ears reached a crescendo. "You shouldn't have come here, James. This is our place. You'll join us now." The storm chose that moment to unleash its full fury. A tremendous crack split the air as lightning struck nearby, followed instantly by a deafening boom of thunder. The world outside my tent flashed brilliant white, then plunged into darkness as the storm knocked out what little ambient light remained. In that momentary illumination, I saw it. A figure silhouetted against my tent entrance. Humanoid but wrong, too tall, too thin, with limbs that bent at unnatural angles. Its head was oversized and oddly shaped, as if swollen with water. When the darkness returned, I scrambled out the back of my tent, slashing a hole in the fabric with my knife. Rain lashed my face as I stumbled into the night, blind with panic. My foot caught on something, a root or stone, and I went down hard, my knife flying from my grasp. I rolled onto my back, eyes desperately trying to pierce the darkness. Lightning flashed again, illuminating the scene in stark relief. My tent was empty. The entrance gaped open, but nothing stood there. Nothing I could see. Another flash revealed something else, indentations in the muddy ground, appearing in sequence. Footprints forming before my eyes, made by something invisible. They came toward me, deliberate and unhurried. I scrambled backward, crab-like, until my back hit the trunk of an ancient oak. The footprints continued their inexorable approach. 10 feet away. 5. 2. They stopped directly in front of me. The rain fell between us, outlining something I couldn't quite see. A shimmer in the air, a distortion like heat rising from hot asphalt. Water streamed off in invisible form, tracing the contours of what could only be a body. "What do you want?" I whispered. In response, the ringing in my ears concentrated, focusing into a single voice that seemed to come from the very air in front of me. "To show you." The ground beneath me shifted, softening like quicksand. Muddy water bubbled up around my legs, then my waist. I clawed at the earth, trying to pull myself free, but there was nothing solid to grip, just mud and water and the inexorable pull downward. "The truth, James." The voice was clearer now, almost compassionate, as if drowning me was an act of kindness. About this place, about us, about what waits below. The mud reached my chest. I could feel things in it, not roots or rocks, but softer things, organic things. Fingers, I realized with horror, countless fingers brushing against me as the swamp pulled me down. Just as the mud reached my neck, a hand broke the surface beside me. A human hand, pale and bloated. It gripped my arm with surprising strength. Then another hand emerged, and another, and dozens of them reaching up from the muck to grasp at my clothes, my limbs, my hair. I screamed then, a sound torn from some primal place beyond rational thought. The storm swallowed my cry, but the hands responded, pulling harder. Not down into the mud, I realized with dawning horror, but up. Something was being pulled from the earth beneath the hammock, something that had been buried. The invisible presence moved closer, its outline now clearer as mud and water clung to its form. I could make out a vaguely humanoid shape, but with proportions all wrong. Limbs too long, torso too thin, head bulbous and misshapen. "We are the lost," it whispered, its voice now bypassing my ears entirely, speaking directly into my mind. "The forgotten, the ones who came before." Lightning struck again, briefly illuminating what was rising from the mud around me. Bodies. Dozens of them in various states of decay, from nearly skeletal to relatively intact. Men, women, some in modern clothing, others in garments that belonged to another century entirely. Explorers, hikers, hunters, slaves fleeing north, soldiers deserting their posts, all who sought refuge in Blackwater. One of the corpses was newer than the others, a young woman in hiking gear that couldn't be more than a few years old. Her face was partially decomposed, but I could still make out features that reminded me, horribly, of Karen. The same dark hair, the same small nose. "Some came seeking solitude," the voice continued. "Others, escape, all found only us." The corpses began to move with jerky, marionette-like motions. They climbed from their muddy graves surrounding me. The woman, not Karen, I told myself desperately, not Karen, reached toward me with blackened fingers. "We need flesh to be seen," the voice explained, "to be heard, to walk among the living again. Your flesh will do nicely, James." The invisible figure stepped closer, now merely a foot away. I could smell it, a noxious combination of stagnant water, rotting vegetation, and something else, something old and patient and hungry. "What are you?" I managed to gasp. "We are Blackwater." The entity reached for me, its invisible hand now partially visible as mud clung to it, outlining long fingers ending in points too sharp to be called nails, more like talons. Time seemed to slow as those fingers reached for my face. In that stretched moment, my mind finally processed what I was seeing, what I was experiencing. This wasn't stress or hallucination or bad luck. This was something ancient and malevolent, something that had claimed this corner of Florida long before humans arrived and would remain long after we were gone. Blackwater wasn't just a name, it was an entity, a hunger, a patient predator that had been feeding for centuries, but I wasn't ready to become its next meal. As those mud-slicked talons reached for my face, my hand closed around something solid in the muck. My hunting knife. With a desperate surge of strength, I brought it up and threw the shimmer where I judged the entity's chest would be. The result was immediate and horrifying. The invisibility shattered like glass, revealing what truly stood before me. It had once been human. That much was clear from its basic form. But whatever humanity it once possessed had been eroded by time and the swamp, leaving something that was more water than flesh. Its skin was the gray-green of cypress bark, mottled with black patches of mold. Its eyes were like twin pools of the darkest water, reflecting nothing but endless depths. Its mouth, a ragged slash in its face, opened in a silent scream as black fluid, not blood, something thicker and more viscous, poured from the wound in its chest. The corpses surrounding me convulsed as one, their movements no longer coordinated but spasmodic and confused. The entity, the thing I had wounded, began to dissolve before my eyes, its form liquefying and running like wax in the rain. "You cannot kill what is already dead," it hissed in my mind, its thought voice weakening. "We are Blackwater. We are eternal." The mud around me began to recede, the swamp water draining away as if someone had pulled a plug. The animated corpses collapsed like puppets with cut strings, sinking back into the earth. The entity fixed its bottomless eyes on me one last time. "We will meet again, James Anderson, in your dreams, in your madness, in the ringing that never stops." Then it was gone, collapsed into a puddle of brackish water that was quickly absorbed by the ground. The storm began to abate as suddenly as it had arrived, the rain tapering to a drizzle, then stopping entirely. The clouds parted, revealing a night sky brilliant with stars. I remained frozen against the oak tree, knife clutched in my trembling hand, waiting for the attack to resume. But nothing came. Just the gentle drip of water from leaves and the distant call of a night bird. The ringing in my ears had stopped. For the first time in months, there was silence in my head. Slowly, cautiously, I got to my feet. My legs threatened to buckle, my entire body shaking with adrenaline and exhaustion. Around me, the hammock showed no sign of the horror I'd just witnessed. No corpses, no disturbed earth. Just a small island in the middle of a cypress swamp, rain-soaked but otherwise ordinary. Had I imagined it all? Some stress-induced hallucination or vivid nightmare? I might have convinced myself of that if not for three things. The slash in my tent that I certainly hadn't dreamed, the mud and unidentifiable black substance coating my hunting knife, and a small object clutched in my left hand that I had no memory of grabbing. It was a locket, ancient and tarnished but still intact. When I pried it open, I found a miniature portrait inside, a woman in 19th century dress, her face somber but beautiful. Inscribed on the inside of the lid were the words, "My Elizabeth, lost to Blackwater, 1842." I spent the night huddled against the oak, too terrified to return to my ruined tent or attempt to leave the hammock in darkness. When dawn finally came, I packed what remained of my gear and made my way back through the swamp with reckless speed. Every splash made my heart race, every shadow concealed potential horrors. It was mid-afternoon when I finally reached my car, mud-caked and exhausted but alive. I drove straight to the nearest motel, took the longest shower of my life, and collapsed into dreamless sleep. I've spent the months since that night researching Blackwater Forest. What I've found is disturbing but not surprising. The area has a history of disappearances dating back to the earliest Spanish explorations. Native American tribes avoided the region entirely, considering it cursed ground. In the 19th century, a settlement called Thornfield was established near the swamp, only to be abandoned after a series of unexplained deaths and disappearances. Most telling was the journal of one Thomas Ellsworth, who wrote of his wife Elizabeth's disappearance in 1842 while gathering herbs near the swamp. The journal described how, in the weeks following her disappearance, Ellsworth began to hear his wife's voice calling to him from the swamp. He claimed to see her standing among the cypress trees at dusk, beckoning him to follow. The final entry, dated October 17, 1842, reads simply, "I go to join my Elizabeth in Blackwater, where she promises we shall be together for eternity. I still have the locket. Sometimes I think I should return it to the swamp, but I can't bring myself to go back. Not yet. Not ever, if I can help it. The ringing in my ears has never returned. In its absence, I've rebuilt my life piece by piece. New job, new apartment, even a tentative new relationship. But I don't go hiking anymore. I don't camp. And I never, ever stay out after dark. Because sometimes, in the moment between wakefulness and sleep, I hear whispers. They call my name, promising to show me wonders beneath the dark water, promising that we'll be together forever. And sometimes I see faces in puddles of rainwater, faces that shouldn't be there, distorted and inhuman, watching me with eyes like bottomless wells. Blackwater is patient, it has eternity to wait, and it knows my name. My name is Jessica Davis, and I am 32 years old. This happened in Tate's Hell State Forest, Florida, last summer when what was meant to be a peaceful weekend camping trip turned into the most horrifying experience of my life. I'd never been particularly outdoorsy, but after my divorce I needed to prove something to myself. Independence, maybe. Or that I could face my fears. The crushing claustrophobia of my empty apartment had become unbearable, so when my colleague Megan Young suggested a weekend trek through Tate's Hell, I surprised both of us by saying yes. "You'll love it," Megan had insisted, her eyes bright with enthusiasm. "There's something magical about that swamp. My family's been going since I was a kid." As the department's resident wildlife biologist, Megan was always trying to drag the rest of us lab technicians into nature. Our third companion was Keith Wilson, another lab tech with an easy smile and a quiet demeanor that balanced Megan's boundless energy. The three of us had grown close over late nights analyzing samples and complaining about our supervisor. When Keith heard about our plans, he immediately asked to join, mentioning he needed photographs of native flora for a personal project. The night before our departure, I Googled Tate's Hell State Forest, immediately regretting it when I discovered how the place got its name. In 1875, a local farmer named C.B. Tate ventured into the swamp with his hunting dog, searching for a panther that had been killing his livestock. He was bitten by a venomous snake, became disoriented, and wandered lost for 7 days and nights. When he finally emerged, delirious and dying, he reportedly gasped, "My name is C.B. Tate, and I just came from hell," before collapsing dead. "Just what I need," I muttered to myself, packing extra batteries for my flashlight. A place literally named after someone's hellish experience. We arrived Friday afternoon, parking at a small lot near the High Bluff Coastal Hiking Trail. The forest sprawled before us, 145,000 acres of cypress domes, wet savannas, and pine flatwoods. As we shouldered our packs, the late June humidity immediately plastered my clothes to my skin. "God, it's hot," Keith complained, swatting at a mosquito. His camera equipment clinked as he adjusted his backpack. "It's Florida in summer. What did you expect?" Megan grinned, already 10 steps ahead on the trail. Her long blonde ponytail swung with each confident stride. "We've got about 3 miles to our campsite. Should make it before sunset if we keep a decent pace." The first hour of our hike was pleasant enough. The trail wound through stands of longleaf pine, their needles whispering overhead in the occasional breeze. Megan pointed out interesting plants and wildlife, transforming into our personal tour guide. I was beginning to think I might actually enjoy this weekend when the first strange thing happened. We'd stopped at a wooden footbridge crossing a narrow waterway choked with lily pads. While Megan and Keith discussed the best angle to photograph a particularly impressive cypress, I noticed a man standing among the trees about 50 yards off the trail. He was tall and gaunt, wearing what looked like old-fashioned clothes, dark pants and a white shirt with the sleeves rolled up despite the heat. Something about his stillness unnerved me. "Hey," I called to my companions, "is someone supposed to be out here?" They both turned. "Where?" Keith asked, squinting in the direction I pointed. "Right there, by that cluster of—" I stopped. The man was gone. He was just there, a tall guy in a white shirt. Megan shrugged. "Probably another hiker. There are multiple trails intersecting through here." I nodded, but a prickle of unease crawled up my spine. Something about the way he'd been standing, so perfectly motionless, watching us, felt wrong. We continued on, and I tried to dismiss the incident. The forest grew denser, the trail narrower. Cypress knees jutted from the soggy ground like bony fingers, and Spanish moss draped from branches like tattered shrouds. The swamp sounds intensified. Frogs, insects, and occasionally splashes in the nearby water that Megan assured us were just fish or maybe small alligators. "Small alligators," Keith repeated dryly. "Fantastic." The trail eventually opened onto a small clearing designated as a primitive campsite. A rustic fire ring of stones sat in the center, and there was enough flat ground for our 3 tents. Beyond the clearing, the land sloped down to a small creek that Megan said connected to the Apalachicola River. "Home sweet home," she announced, dropping her pack. I stayed here with my dad years ago. It's perfect." We set up camp efficiently, working together to pitch tents and gather firewood before dusk fell. Keith collected water from the creek using Megan's filter, while I arranged stones to expand the fire ring. By the time darkness descended, we had a cheerful blaze going and were cooking freeze-dried meals over Keith's portable stove. The night closed in around our small circle of firelight. The swamp transformed in the darkness, becoming a wall of impenetrable shadow punctuated by unfamiliar sounds. Hoots, croaks, splashes, and occasionally, something that sounded unnervingly like distant laughter. "So, who wants to hear a local legend?" Megan asked, her face ghostly in the firelight. Keith groaned. "Is this really the time?" "It's a camping trip. We're required by law to tell scary stories." She looked at me with a mischievous smile. "Ever heard of the Tate's Hell Witch?" I shook my head, immediately regretting my curiosity. "They say she was a woman named Eleanor Blackwood, who lived alone in a cabin deep in these swamps back in the 1920s. The locals thought she was a healer at first. People would come to her with ailments that doctors couldn't fix, and she'd give them tinctures and herbs that worked like magic." Megan's voice dropped lower. "But then, children started disappearing from nearby settlements. 3 kids over 2 years. They'd wander into the woods and never come out. The last one was the sheriff's daughter, 7 years old. The search party followed her tracks right to Eleanor's cabin. A log in the fire collapsed, sending up a shower of sparks that made me flinch. They found the little girl's shoes under Eleanor's bed, still with her feet inside them." Megan's face was solemn. Eleanor claimed an entity in the swamp demanded sacrifices. Said if she didn't provide them, it would take everyone. The mob didn't listen. They hanged her from a cypress tree and burned her cabin down. The fire crackled in the silence that followed. "That's pleasant," Keith said finally. "It gets better," Megan continued. "Before she died, Eleanor cursed them all. Said the hungry thing in the swamp would come for them now that she'd been protecting them by choosing the sacrifices carefully. One by one, the men who hanged her died. Hunting accidents, drownings. One man was found with his throat torn out by what they claimed was a panther. And they say her spirit still wanders these woods, either warning hikers about the hungry entity or leading them straight to it, depending on whether she likes you or not." I shivered despite the warmth of the fire. "And you brought us here, why exactly?" Megan laughed. "Oh, come on, it's just a story. Besides, I've been here dozens of times and never seen Eleanor's ghost." "I'm with Jessica," Keith said. "Next time, maybe pick a camping spot that doesn't have a cannibalistic witch in its history." We stayed up a while longer, trying to lighten the mood with more mundane conversation about work and office gossip. Eventually, we doused the fire and retreated to our respective tents. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to the symphony of night creatures and trying to convince myself that every rustle and snap wasn't Eleanor Blackwood coming to judge whether I deserved to be the swamp's next sacrifice. Despite my anxiety, exhaustion eventually pulled me under. I dreamed of wading through murky water while something brushed against my legs beneath the surface. In the dream, I looked down to see pale hands reaching up from the depths, trying to grip my ankles. A scream jarred me awake, high-pitched and abruptly cut short. I bolted upright, heart hammering. The interior of my tent was pitch black, and for a panicked moment I couldn't remember where the zipper was. Finally, my fingers found it, and I peered outside. The clearing was washed in moonlight. Everything looked peaceful. Keith's tent to my left, Megan's to my right. Nothing moved. Had I dreamed the scream? "Megan," I called softly. "Keith, did you hear something?" No response came from either tent. Unzipping my tent further, I crawled out, standing barefoot on the cool ground. The forest around us had fallen eerily silent. No frogs, no insects, as if everything was holding its breath. I approached Keith's tent first. "Keith?" I whispered, then louder. "Keith, are you awake?" When no answer came, I hesitantly unzipped his tent flap. The beam of my flashlight revealed an empty sleeping bag, neatly made as if it hadn't been slept in at all, His backpack was still there, camera equipment arranged carefully beside it. A surge of fear pushed me toward Megan's tent. "Megan!" I called, no longer bothering to whisper. Her tent was empty too, sleeping bag rumpled, but no sign of her. I stood in the center of our campsite, flashlight beam cutting frantically through the darkness. "Keith! Megan! This isn't funny!" Only silence answered. They couldn't both have left without me hearing them. My tent was positioned between theirs. They would have had to walk right past me. My first coherent thought was that they might have gone to the creek, perhaps to get water, or I didn't know what else they might be doing in the middle of the night. Clutching my flashlight like a weapon, I followed the sloping ground toward the water. The creek glimmered under the moonlight, its surface undisturbed. No sign of my friends. I was turning back toward camp when my flashlight beam caught something pale among the reeds near the water's edge. I moved closer, my breath shallow. It was a piece of fabric, the sleeve of Megan's distinctive purple hiking shirt. It was torn and stained with something dark. My hand trembled as I reached for it, but before my fingers could touch the material, a violent splash erupted from the creek. Water sprayed my face as something large thrashed just beneath the surface, moving away rapidly. I stumbled backward, nearly falling, and ran back to the campsite. My mind raced through possibilities. An alligator? Had Megan gone to the creek and been attacked? But where was Keith? Back at camp, I frantically searched for my phone, but the signal indicator showed nothing but empty bars. I tried anyway, dialing 911 repeatedly, each attempt more desperate than the last. Nothing connected. "Think, Jessica," I muttered to myself. "Think." The rational part of my brain suggested waiting until dawn before trying to find help. We'd passed a ranger station about 4 miles back on the trail, but the primal part of me, the part screaming that something was deeply wrong, wanted to grab my things and run. Now, darkness be damned. A twig snapped in the forest beyond our clearing. My head jerked up, flashlight beam swinging wildly toward the sound. "Who's there?" My voice cracked. "Megan? Keith?" Another snap, closer this time. Then another. Someone was approaching through the trees. The footsteps were slow, deliberate. I backed up until I bumped against a tree trunk, my free hand fumbling for anything I could use as a weapon. A figure emerged from the darkness into the moonlit clearing. It was Keith, but something was wrong. He moved stiffly, his gait unnatural. His head hung at an odd angle. "Keith! Oh, thank God!" I gasped. "Where's Megan? What happened?" He didn't respond, just continued walking toward me with that strange, stiff gait. As he came closer, moonlight revealed his face, and the scream building in my throat died. His eyes were open but empty, glassy and unfocused. Dark veins spread across his face like spiderwebs beneath his skin. His lips moved, but the voice that emerged wasn't his. "She doesn't like you," Keith's mouth said, in a high, feminine voice with an old-fashioned accent. "She says you don't belong here." I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Keith stopped a few feet from me, head tilting at an impossible angle. "Who?" I finally managed. "Who doesn't like me?" A smile spread across Keith's face, too wide, stretching his lips unnaturally. "The swamp, the hungry thing in the water. It's been so patient, waiting for Eleanor to bring it more." My legs finally remembered how to work. I ran, not toward the trail we'd come from, which would mean passing too close to whatever was wearing Keith's body, but in the opposite direction, deeper into the forest. I heard him behind me, twigs snapping under his pursuing feet. I ran blindly, branches whipping my face, roots threatening to trip me with every step. The ground grew soggier, water seeping into my shoes. I was entering the true swamp now, leaving the relative safety of the established trails. The sound of pursuit faded, but I didn't slow down until my lungs burned and my legs threatened to give out. I stopped, bent double, trying to quiet my ragged breathing enough to listen. Nothing but the normal swamp sounds had resumed. Frogs, insects, the rustle of nocturnal creatures. I was hopelessly lost. The moonlight barely penetrated the dense canopy here, and I'd left camp with nothing but my flashlight and the clothes I'd slept in. Thin shorts and a t-shirt. No water, no food, no protection from the elements or whatever had taken over my friend. Shining my flashlight in a slow circle, I tried to get my bearings. The beam reflected off water on 3 sides. I was on some sort of small island or hummock in the swamp. The ground was relatively dry, covered in fallen leaves and pine needles. It would have to do for now. I couldn't risk wandering blindly through a swamp at night. I settled with my back against a tree trunk, flashlight clutched in my sweaty hand. Every sound made me flinch. The plop of a frog entering water, the distant hoot of an owl, the whispering rustle of wind through cypress needles. I didn't expect to sleep, but exhaustion eventually overcame terror, and I drifted into uneasy unconsciousness. The sound of humming woke me. A woman's voice, singing a melody I didn't recognize, old-fashioned and eerie. My eyes flew open to early morning light filtering through the trees. Mist hung over the water surrounding my little island, and through the mist walked a woman. She moved across the water's surface as if it were solid ground, her long skirts trailing just above the murky surface. She was tall and thin, with dark hair pulled back severely from a pale face. Her clothes were from another time, a high-necked white blouse and dark skirt that might have been fashionable a century ago. I pressed myself against the tree, willing myself to disappear into its bark. The humming stopped as she reached the edge of my island. She smiled, revealing teeth that were too sharp, too numerous. "You're not supposed to be here," she said, in the same voice I'd heard from Keith's mouth. "This isn't your sacrifice day." My mouth was too dry to speak. I clutched my flashlight tighter, knowing it was useless as a weapon but unable to let go. "You're Eleanor," I finally managed. She tilted her head, the movement unnervingly similar to what I'd seen Keith do. "What's left of her? The swamp has most of me now." She glided onto the land, her feet making no sound on the fallen leaves. "Your friends were marked. The Hungry One chose them long ago, called to them in dreams. But you're an unexpected guest at the feast. What did you do to them?" I demanded, finding courage in anger. Eleanor's smile widened. "The girl is feeding the depths now. The boy serves as my voice, my hands. The Hungry One doesn't want him. Too bitter, too filled with old grief. But it loves the taste of the girl's bright energy." I thought of Megan's enthusiasm, her love of these woods that had apparently been luring her to her death for years. Tears stung my eyes. "Why are you telling me this? Are you going to kill me too?" Eleanor stopped a few feet away. "I told you, you're not marked. The Hungry One doesn't call to you. That makes you interesting." She cocked her head again. "I could help you leave, guide you back to the path. Why would you do that?" "Because choice is power," she said simply. "The Hungry One takes what it wants, when it wants. I have so few choices left. Helping you would be my choice." I didn't trust her, couldn't trust her, but I had no idea how to find my way back without help. "If I follow you, you'll lead me to safety? Not to whatever has, Keith? I'll take you to the trail. What finds you there is beyond my concern." She turned and began walking into the water again. "Come or stay. Choose quickly." I hesitated, then scrambled to my feet. The alternative was to remain lost in a swamp with dwindling daylight and no supplies. At least following her gave me a chance. Eleanor moved gracefully through the water, always staying just ahead, occasionally looking back to ensure I was following. I waded through knee-deep water, wincing at the cold and trying not to think about what might be swimming around my legs. We walked for what felt like hours. The scenery never seemed to change. Cypress trees rising from dark water, patches of higher ground covered in palmettos, the omnipresent curtains of Spanish moss. The sun climbed higher, and sweat soaked my shirt. My stomach growled with hunger, my throat parched with thirst. "How much further?" I called out. Eleanor didn't answer, just kept walking. I noticed with growing unease that the water was getting deeper, now reaching mid-thigh. I stopped. "This isn't the way to the trail." She turned, that too wide smile spreading across her face again. "You chose to follow. You said you'd lead me to safety." "I said I'd take you to the path. All paths in Tate's Hell lead to the same place eventually." She gestured around us. "Every step takes you closer to the Hungry One." Cold fear washed over me, stronger than the heat of the day. I'd been a fool to trust her. I turned to retrace my steps, but the landscape behind me had changed. Or perhaps we'd wound around so much that I was disoriented. Either way, I couldn't tell which direction I'd come from. "You can't leave now," Eleanor said, her voice almost gentle. "You've walked the water paths. You're part of the swamp's story now." I backed away from her, willing to take my chances alone. "Stay away from me." Her form seemed to waver, like heat rising from asphalt. "It's not me you should fear." The water around my legs suddenly felt different, thicker with an odd current pulling subtly at my calves. I looked down and screamed. The water had turned black, not with mud or sediment, but with a darkness that seemed to absorb light. And in that darkness, pale shapes moved. Hands, faces, pressing up from below as if against a membrane, reaching for me. I ran, splashing desperately toward what looked like higher ground. The water clutched at me, trying to hold me back. Something brushed against my leg, fingers grabbing at my ankle. I kicked free and lunged forward, finally reaching a small island similar to the one I'd spent the night on. Collapsing on relatively dry ground, I looked back. Eleanor was gone. The water had returned to its normal murky brown. No sign of the darkness or the pale, reaching hands. Had I hallucinated it all? Dehydration and fear could do strange things to the mind. But I knew what I'd seen. Just as I knew, with bone-deep certainty, that I needed to find my way out of this swamp before nightfall. The sun offered some direction. It was past noon now, heading westward. We'd hiked in from the east, so if I could keep the sun at my back for the remainder of the day, I might eventually hit the main trail. It was a desperate plan, but the only one I had. I set off, staying on patches of higher ground when possible, waiting when necessary. The heat was oppressive, insects relentless. My exposed skin was covered in bites, my feet blistered in my wet shoes. Several times I thought I glimpsed movement in the corner of my eye, a tall figure in white watching from between distant trees. But when I turned to look directly, nothing was there. The afternoon wore on. My mouth was so dry that my tongue felt swollen, my lips cracked and bleeding. The landscape all looked the same, an endless repetition of water, cypress, and patches of higher ground. I began to wonder if I was walking in circles. Then, miraculously, I spotted something that didn't belong, a flash of bright blue through the trees. Drawing closer, I realized it was a trail marker. I'd found a path. Relief made me dizzy. I hurried forward following the markers. This wasn't the trail we'd come in on. It was narrower, less maintained, but any marked path would eventually lead to civilization. The trail wound through increasingly dense forest. The markers became harder to spot, and I had to backtrack several times when I lost the path. The sun was getting lower, golden light filtering through the trees at a steep angle. I wasn't going to make it out before dark. I quickened my pace, tripping over roots in my haste. If I could just get a little further, maybe I'd reach a road or a ranger station. The alternative, another night in Tate's Hell, was unthinkable. The path abruptly ended at a small clearing. In the center stood a dilapidated cabin, its wood weathered to silver gray, its windows dark, empty sockets. My heart sank. This wasn't a way out. It was just an abandoned structure in the middle of nowhere. As I stood there, trying to decide whether to keep going or turn back, the last rays of the setting sun illuminated something hanging from a large cypress at the edge of the clearing. It took me a moment to recognize it. A length of old rope, frayed and darkened with age, hanging from a sturdy branch at just the right height for a noose. This was where they had hanged Eleanor Blackwood, which meant this ruined cabin. A chill ran through me despite the lingering heat of the day. I was standing before the witch's home, the place where they'd found the little girl's severed feet and shoes under the bed. I should turn back, find another way. But darkness was falling fast, and I had no idea which direction would lead me to safety. At least the cabin offered shelter, a roof over my head for the night. With deep reluctance, I approached the structure. The wooden steps creaked ominously under my weight. The door hung askew on rusted hinges, opening into absolute darkness. Using my flashlight, I examined the interior. It was a single room, empty except for the broken remains of what might have been a table or chair in one corner. The floorboards were rotted in places, and the roof had partially collapsed on one side, allowing a view of the darkening sky. It wasn't much, but it would keep most of the night's dew off me. I cleared a space in the corner furthest from the door and sat with my back against the wall, flashlight clutched to my chest. The battery was weakening, the beam noticeably dimmer than it had been the night before. I switched it off to conserve power, plunging myself into darkness broken only by faint moonlight through the collapsed section of roof. Huddled in that corner, exhaustion and dehydration finally caught up with me. Despite my fear, my eyes grew heavy. Just before sleep claimed me, I heard it, the soft humming of a woman's voice coming from everywhere and nowhere. I jerked awake sometime later to absolute silence. No insects, no frogs, no nightbirds, just like the previous night before Keith had appeared with someone else's voice. My flashlight flickered weakly when I switched it on, barely illuminating the cabin's interior. A scraping sound came from the doorway. My light swung that direction, catching a glimpse of something withdrawing quickly into the night, a pale hand disappearing around the door frame. "Who's there?" My voice was a hoarse whisper. A soft laugh answered, followed by footsteps on the porch. Not Eleanor's silent gliding, but heavy, deliberate steps. A figure appeared in the doorway. Keith, or what used to be Keith. His condition had deteriorated since I'd last seen him. The dark veins had spread further across his face and his skin had a grayish cast. His head still hung at that unnatural angle. "She sent me to find you," he said, in that high, feminine voice that wasn't his. "The hungry one is impatient." I pressed myself harder against the wall. "Stay back." Keith's body took a step into the cabin. "You're in her house. You chose to come here." Another step. "Now you'll go to the water, to the deep place where the hungry one waits." "No," I said, scrambling to my feet. "I'm leaving. I'm finding my way out. There is no way out for you now." Another step. "The swamp has your scent, your taste. It won't let you leave." I edged along the wall, trying to circle toward the door. Keith moved to block my path, his movements jerky but quick like a marionette controlled by an unskilled puppeteer. "What happened to Megan?" I asked, desperate to buy time. A grotesque smile stretched Keith's face. "She fed the hungry one. Her fear was sweet, her flesh sweeter." His head tilted further, bones cracking audibly. "Yours will be too." He lunged suddenly, hands outstretched toward my throat. I ducked under his arms and ran for the door, but his fingers caught my shirt, yanking me backward. I fell hard, the rotted floorboards cracking beneath me. Keith was on me in an instant, his weight pinning me down, those empty eyes staring into mine. His hands wrapped around my throat, cutting off my air. I clawed at his face, his arms, but he didn't react to pain. Black spots danced in my vision as his grip tightened. With my last coherent thought, I drove my knee up between his legs. Keith's body might be possessed by something inhuman, but it was still anatomically male. He howled in a mixture of voices, his own deep cry of pain combined with Eleanor's higher shriek of rage. His grip loosened just enough for me to gasp a breath and heave him sideways. He rolled off me, and I scrambled away, but my foot went through a rotted section of floor. I fell again, my leg trapped up to the knee in splintered wood. Keith was recovering, rising to his feet with those jerky, unnatural movements. Frantically, I tugged at my trapped leg. The jagged wood tore at my skin, but fear gave me strength. With a final desperate wrench, I pulled free, leaving behind skin and blood. Keith shambled toward me. I cast about for a weapon, anything to defend myself. My hand closed around a broken piece of floorboard, long, with a splintered end like a stake. As Keith reached for me again, I swung it with all my strength at his head. The makeshift weapon connected with a sickening crack. Keith's body went rigid, then crumpled to the floor. Dark fluid that didn't look quite like blood seeped from the wound. I stood frozen, the board still clutched in my shaking hands. Had I killed him? Was there anything of Keith left to kill? A low moan escaped his lips, but the voice was his own this time. Pained, confused. Jessica. His eyes, clear now of that empty glassiness, found mine. What? Where are we? Keith? I knelt beside him, hope and suspicion warring within me. Is it really you? He winced, hand going to the wound on his temple. My head. What happened? The last thing I remember is going to sleep in my tent. I helped him sit up, watching his face carefully for any sign of Eleanor's influence. His movements were normal now, his eyes focused, confused but present. Something took control of you, I explained hesitantly. Something in the swamp. It got Megan. Pain crossed his face, whether from the wound or my words I couldn't tell. Megan, he whispered. Is she? I nodded, tears finally coming. I think so. I found part of her shirt by the creek. There was blood. Keith's face crumpled. He and Megan had been friends longer than I'd known either of them. I'd suspected there might have been more between them once, though neither had ever confirmed it. We need to get out of here, I said, helping him to his feet. Can you walk? He nodded, swaying slightly. I think so, but I don't know if I can find the trail in the dark. We have to try, I insisted. We can't stay here, not in her cabin. Keith frowned. Whose cabin? Before I could answer, a cold wind swept through the ruined structure, extinguishing what little light my flashlight still produced. The humming started again, louder now, right beside us. You broke my puppet, Eleanor's voice came from the darkness. That was very rude. Keith tensed beside me. Who's that? Jessica, who's talking? Eleanor materialized in the faint moonlight streaming through the broken roof, a tall, gaunt figure in white and black, her form flickering like a candle flame. You freed him, she said, ignoring Keith's questions. Interesting. The hungry one rarely loses its grip once it has a taste. I clutched the broken board tighter. Let us go. We just want to leave. Eleanor's head tilted in that disturbing angle. The hungry one has been patient. It's waited so long for the girl with sunshine in her hair. Now it wants compensation for losing the other one. There's nothing we can do about that, I said, edging toward the door, pulling Keith with me. We're leaving. No, Eleanor said simply. One of you is staying. Forever. Keith stepped in front of me. Take me then. Let Jessica go. Keith, no. I tried to pull him back. He shook me off. You already had me once, he told Eleanor. You can have me again if you let her go. Eleanor's form wavered, seeming to consider. Noble. But the hungry one doesn't want nobility. It wants fear. Sweet, succulent fear. She moved toward us with unnatural speed, her form becoming smoke-like, engulfing Keith before I could react. He screamed, the sound cutting off as his body went rigid. Then he turned to me, and I knew Eleanor was inside him again. Run, little rabbit, Keith's mouth said in Eleanor's voice. Run to the water. The hungry one is waiting. I didn't hesitate. I bolted through the door and into the night, the broken board still clutched in my hand. Behind me, Keith's possessed body pursued with those jerky, puppet-like movements. I ran blindly through the forest, branches whipping my face, roots threatening to trip me. The ground sloped downward, becoming marshy. Water splashed around my ankles, then my calves. I was heading deeper into the swamp. Realizing my mistake, I veered left, trying to find higher ground. The splashing behind me indicated Keith was still in pursuit, though I'd gained some distance. My lungs burned, my injured leg throbbed with each step, but terror kept me moving. I broke through a line of trees onto what appeared to be a dirt road, an old logging track perhaps. Hope surged through me. If I could follow this, it might lead to a main road. I turned right arbitrarily and ran along the track, my feet finding better purchase on the relatively smooth surface. The sounds of pursuit faded, then disappeared altogether. Still, I didn't slow down until my body simply couldn't continue. Collapsing beside the track, I gulped air into my burning lungs. The night was quiet around me. Too quiet. No insects chirped. No frogs called. Just like before, something appeared. I struggled to my feet, raising the board defensively. Nothing moved in the darkness surrounding the track. Maybe I'd truly outrun whatever was controlling Keith. Maybe it could only reach so far from the heart of the swamp. Dawn was breaking when I finally stumbled onto Highway 65, the main road cutting through Tate's Hell State Forest. An early morning driver, a fisherman heading to the coast, stopped and picked me up, alarmed by my appearance. I must have looked half mad, clothes torn and filthy, skin covered in scratches and insect bites, eyes wild with exhaustion and fear. I told him I'd gotten separated from my camping group, that I had friends still missing in the swamp. He drove me straight to the ranger station where I reported Keith and Megan missing. The search lasted 5 days. They found our campsite undisturbed except for the empty tents. No sign of struggle, no blood, no evidence of what had happened. They never found Keith's body. My name is William Brown, and I am 34 years old. This happened in Tate's Hell State Forest, Florida, just last summer. "Come on, Will, we're burning daylight," Kevin shouted from 20 yards ahead on the trail. The July sun filtered through the cypress canopy, casting dappled shadows across the forest floor. Our weekend hiking trip was Kevin's idea, a chance to reconnect with nature after spending the last 6 months hunched over our laptops in our cubicles at the insurance firm. I adjusted my backpack straps and wiped sweat from my forehead. "Some of us are carrying the tent, genius," I called back, but Kevin just laughed and disappeared around a bend in the trail. There were 4 of us total. Kevin King, our self-appointed leader who'd somehow convinced us all that venturing into Tate's Hell State Forest for 3 days would be rejuvenating. Marcus Reed, our office's new IT guy who barely spoke above a whisper but supposedly had extensive camping experience. And Darren Walsh, my cubicle neighbor who'd only agreed to come because his wife insisted he needed male bonding time. And then there was me, William Brown, who hadn't set foot in a forest since a disastrous Boy Scout campout 20 years ago, but after my divorce finalized 3 months back, I'd been saying yes to everything just to keep my mind occupied. You know why they call it Tate's Hell, right? Marcus had suddenly appeared beside me, his voice so soft I almost missed it over the chorus of insects. "Some old folk tale, I'm guessing," I replied, not particularly interested. In 1875, a local farmer named C.B. Tate ventured into these swamps hunting a panther that had been killing his livestock. He got lost, was bitten by a venomous snake, and wandered the swamp for 7 days and nights. When he finally emerged, delirious and near death, his last words were, "My name is C.B. Tate, and I just came from hell." Marcus's eyes never left the trail as he spoke. "That's cheerful," I muttered. "Remind me why we're here again?" Marcus just shrugged and quickened his pace to catch up with Kevin. We hiked another 3 miles before finding a suitable camping spot near the edge of a small, dark pond. The late afternoon sun was already beginning to sink, casting long shadows across our campsite. As I helped Darren set up our tent, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us from the dense wall of cypress and palmetto that surrounded the clearing. "Did you guys know cell reception is basically non-existent out here?" Darren complained, glancing at his phone for the 100th time. "What if there's an emergency?" "That's the whole point," Kevin said, arranging stones for a fire pit. "Disconnecting. Being present. Not checking work emails every 5 minutes." I noticed Marcus standing at the edge of the pond, staring into the dark water. "Everything okay?" I called to him. He turned slowly. "There are things in these swamps that weren't here before," he said, his voice barely audible. "What, like invasive species?" Kevin asked, not looking up from his work. Marcus didn't answer. He just continued staring into the water. By nightfall, we had a decent fire going and were roasting hot dogs on sticks. The night sounds of the swamp created an unsettling symphony. Croaking frogs, chirping insects, and occasionally something larger splashing in the nearby water. "So, did anyone bring booze?" Darren asked hopefully. Kevin produced a flask from his pack. "Bourbon, the great social lubricant." We passed the flask around, and I felt the alcohol warm my chest and loosen the tension in my shoulders. The fire crackled, casting our shadows against the surrounding trees. Our conversation drifted from office gossip to sports to our personal lives. "Will's the only one who knows what freedom really feels like," Kevin said, nudging me with his elbow. "No wife, no kids, no responsibility." "Yeah, freedom feels a lot like eating microwave dinners alone and forgetting what your own voice sounds like," I replied, taking another swig from the flask. "You'll bounce back," Darren said with the patronizing confidence of someone who'd been happily married for 15 years. The conversation continued, but I found myself distracted by movement in the trees beyond our campfire's light. Every few minutes I thought I saw something, a shadow moving independently of the flames flickering, a flash of eyes reflecting the firelight. But whenever I focused my attention, there was nothing there. "Anyone else notice how quiet it's gotten?" Marcus suddenly said. He was right. The chorus of frogs and insects had fallen silent, leaving only the crackling of our fire. "Probably just an alligator nearby," Kevin said dismissively. "They're all over these swamps." "It's not that," Marcus whispered, his eyes scanning the darkness. "Listen." We all fell silent. At first, I heard nothing. Then, faintly, a sound reached my ears, a low, rhythmic humming, almost like chanting, coming from somewhere deep in the forest. "Probably just campers," Darren suggested, but his voice had lost its casual tone. "There's no one else out here," Marcus said. "I checked with the ranger station before we left. No other permits issued for this section of the forest this weekend." "You're freaking us out for nothing," Kevin said, but he too was staring into the darkness now. "It's just the wind in the cypress trees or something." But it wasn't the wind. The humming grew slightly louder, more distinct, multiple voices, low and monotonous, repeating the same pattern over and over, and underneath it all, a different sound, the wet, heavy breathing of something large. "We should go," Marcus said suddenly, standing up. "Now." "Don't be ridiculous," Kevin replied. "We're not packing up camp in the middle of the night because of some weird noises." "Kevin's right," Darren added. "Whatever it is, it's probably far away. Sound carries differently over water." Marcus looked at me, his eyes wide with fear. "Will?" I hesitated. Part of me wanted to trust Marcus's instincts. Something felt wrong, but the rational part of my brain sided with Kevin. "Let's just keep the fire going tonight. Take watch shifts." No one slept well that night. The humming eventually faded, but the silence that replaced it was somehow worse. I took the first watch, sitting by the fire with Kevin's hunting knife in my hand, staring into the darkness until my eyes burned. Nothing approached our camp, but twice I heard splashing in the pond, something large entering or exiting the water. When I finally crawled into the tent around 2 a.m., passing watch duty to Darren, my dreams were filled with distorted images. Pale figures moving beneath the pond's surface, eyes watching from between cypress trunks, and over the image of a man emerging from the swamp, his skin bloated and gray, whispering, "I just came from hell." I woke to screaming. Daylight filtered through the tent fabric as I bolted upright. Beside me, Marcus was already scrambling for the tent zipper. Outside, Kevin was shouting incoherently. We burst from the tent to find Kevin standing by the ashes of our fire, pointing toward the pond. "Where the hell is Darren?" he demanded. The campsite looked undisturbed. Darren's sleeping bag was still in his and Kevin's tent. His backpack leaned against a tree, but Darren was nowhere to be seen. "Maybe he went to take a piss," I suggested. But even as I said it, I knew something was wrong. Darren wouldn't wander off alone, not after the uneasiness of the previous night. "His boots are still here," Marcus said quietly, pointing to Darren's hiking boots neatly placed outside his tent. A cold weight settled in my stomach. "Darren!" I shouted. "Darren!" My voice echoed across the pond and was swallowed by the forest. No response. "We need to search," Kevin said, his voice tight with worry. "He couldn't have gone far." We spent the next hour combing the area around our campsite, calling Darren's name until our voices grew hoarse. We found nothing. No tracks, no signs of struggle, no evidence of where he might have gone. It was as if he had simply vanished into the swamp. "This is impossible," Kevin muttered, running his hands through his hair. "People don't just disappear." "We need to go for help," I said. "Hike back to the ranger station." Marcus had been unnaturally quiet during our search. Now he stood at the edge of the pond, staring into the dark water just as he had the day before. "He's in there," Marcus said suddenly, pointing at the pond. Kevin and I exchanged glances. The pond? Why would he be in there? "Not Darren," Marcus whispered. The thing that took him." "What are you talking about?" Kevin demanded, striding over to Marcus. "What thing?" Marcus turned to face us, his eyes wide and unfocused. "Last night, on my watch, I saw something come out of the water. It looked like a man, but not. Its skin was like wet paper and its mouth—" He shuddered. "I thought I was hallucinating. I must have dozed off after that, because the next thing I knew, it was morning, and Darren was gone." "You fell asleep on watch?" Kevin shouted, grabbing Marcus by the collar. "Are you serious?" I pulled Kevin away. "That's not helping. We need to focus on finding Darren." "We're not going to find him," Marcus said quietly. "He's gone, like the others." "What others?" I asked. "I lied about checking with the ranger station," Marcus admitted, not meeting our eyes. "I've been tracking disappearances in this part of Tate's Hell for months. 3 hikers in the past year all gone without a trace, all near this pond." Kevin and I stared at him in stunned silence. "Why the hell would you bring us here?" Kevin finally exploded. "What is wrong with you?" "I needed to see it for myself," Marcus whispered. "I needed to know what was taking them." Before Kevin could respond, a splash from the pond drew our attention. Ripples spread across the surface of the water, though there was no breeze. "We're leaving," Kevin declared. "Now, grab your stuff." We hastily packed our gear, leaving Darren's belongings untouched in case search and rescue needed them later. As Marcus and Kevin argued about which trail to take back, I noticed something floating near the edge of the pond, a small object that hadn't been there before. I approached cautiously, squinting at the item bobbing gently in the murky water. My blood turned to ice when I recognized it. Darren's wedding ring. I fished it out with a stick, noting with growing horror that the gold band was bent and misshapen, as if it had been crushed by enormous pressure. "Guys," I called, my voice shaking, "we need to go. Now." As I turned to rejoin them, movement caught my eye, a ripple in the water different from the gentle lapping at the shore. Something was surfacing in the center of the pond. At first I thought it was a log or perhaps an alligator, but as it rose higher, I realized with mounting horror that it had a human shape. A head emerged, then shoulders, then a torso. All the color of wet clay, the texture wrong, as if the skin were decaying right before my eyes. "Run!" I screamed, backing away from the shore. Kevin and Marcus turned, and I heard Kevin curse loudly as the figure continued to rise from the water. It was the height of a tall man now, standing impossibly on the pond's surface, water streaming from its body. We ran. The forest that had seemed merely eerie the day before now felt actively hostile. Branches snagged our clothes, roots appeared underfoot where none had been before, and the trail itself seemed to shift and wind differently than I remembered. "Which way?" Kevin gasped as we reached a fork I didn't recall from our hike-in. "Left," Marcus said without hesitation. Always left in a maze. We tore down the left path, the sounds of our panicked breathing and crashing footsteps drowning out whatever might be pursuing us. After what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes, we collapsed in exhaustion beside a massive cypress tree. Did anyone see if that thing followed us?" Darren wheezed. No one answered. We were all too busy trying to catch our breath, our eyes scanning the forest around us. Nothing seemed to be moving among the trees, but the swamp had fallen unnaturally silent again. No birds, no insects, as if every living thing were holding its breath. "What the hell was that?" Kevin finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Marcus shook his head. Local legends talk about the Swamp Walker, a spirit of those who died lost in Tate's hell. Some say it's Seb Tate himself, cursed to wander these swamps forever, taking others to join him in his hell. "That's ridiculous," Kevin snapped, but without conviction. We had all seen the figure rise from the pond. "We need to keep moving," I said, standing on shaky legs. "The ranger station can't be more than 5 or 6 miles from here." As we gathered ourselves to continue, I noticed Marcus staring at something on the ground near the base of the cypress tree. "What is it?" I asked. He pointed silently. Half buried in the soil and partially obscured by fallen leaves was a hiking boot, identical to the ones Darren had left behind at camp. "That could be anyone's," Kevin said, his voice strained. "This is a public forest." Marcus knelt and brushed away some of the leaves, revealing more. Not just a boot, but a foot still inside it, pale, bloated, and very clearly no longer attached to a leg. Kevin retched into the underbrush. I stood frozen, unable to process what I was seeing. Marcus reached toward the decaying appendage. "Don't touch it," I hissed. "Look," he said, pointing to a metallic glint near what remained of the ankle. A watch. Stainless steel with a black face, exactly like the one Darren had been wearing. "That's impossible," Kevin whispered, wiping his mouth. "We just left camp 20 minutes ago." A low, rhythmic humming began to fill the air around us. The same chanting we'd heard the night before, but closer now, coming from all directions at once. Between the trees, shadows moved just at the edge of visibility. "We need to go," Marcus said urgently. "Now." We ran again, no longer following any trail, just crashing through the underbrush in what we hoped was the direction of the ranger station. The humming followed us, growing louder, and underneath it, that same wet, heavy breathing. The forest grew denser, the ground beneath our feet increasingly waterlogged. We were moving deeper into swampland, not toward the forest edge as we'd intended. "We're going the wrong way," I shouted to the others. "There is no right way," Marcus called back, his voice tight with fear. "The forest won't let us leave." It sounded insane, but I was beginning to believe him. Nothing about this forest made sense anymore. The sun, which should have been high overhead by now, seemed stuck just above the horizon, casting long shadows that pointed in impossible directions. We stumbled into a small clearing and stopped short. In the center stood a crude structure. A circle of weathered wooden posts driven into the ground, each topped with something I initially mistook for oddly shaped fungi. As we drew closer, I realized with mounting horror that they were shoes, hiking boots, sneakers, work boots, dozens of them, in various states of decay. "What the hell?" Kevin whispered. Marcus approached the nearest post, examining the boot perched atop it. "Some of these must be decades old," he said, his voice hollow. The humming grew louder, and with it came a smell, the stench of stagnant water and decomposition. The air around us seemed to thicken, making each breath a struggle. "We should have never come here," Kevin said, backing away from the macabre display. "This is wrong. This whole place is wrong." A splash sounded from behind us. We turned to find that a pond now stretched where solid ground had been moments before, the same dark, still water as the pond by our campsite. And rising from its center, the figure, the ewe. In the daylight, what little filtered through the canopy, I could see it clearly. It had the shape of a man, but was wrong in every detail. Skin the color and texture of river clay, features half-formed as if sculpted by an unskilled hand, limbs too long and jointed in too many places. Water continuously streamed from its body, yet it never seemed to diminish, and its face, where eyes should have been, were just empty sockets, but somehow I knew it was looking directly at me. Its mouth opened, impossibly wide, and from it came a voice that sounded like water rushing over stones. "My name is C.B. Tate, and you just came to hell." The thing that called itself C.B. Tate moved toward us with a fluid grace that defied its misshapen form. Each step it took on the water's surface sent ripples outward, and where those ripples touched the shore, the ground seemed to dissolve into more swamp. "Run!" Kevin screamed, snapping us from our horrified trance. We scattered in different directions. I crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping my face, mud sucking at my boots. Behind me, I heard Kevin shouting, then Marcus's higher-pitched scream, then silence. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs threatened to give out, finally collapsing against the trunk of a massive cypress. The swamp had gone completely silent. No birds, no insects, not even the sound of wind through the branches. Just my own ragged breathing and the pounding of blood in my ears. When I finally caught my breath enough to look around, I realized with a sinking feeling that I had no idea where I was. The landscape offered no landmarks, no trail markers, nothing to orient myself by. The sun, which should have been my guide, now seemed to be in a different position than it had been moments ago, as if time itself were distorted in this place. "Kevin?" I called, my voice sounding weak and frail in the oppressive silence. "Marcus?" No answer. I was alone. Or so I thought until I heard the humming again. That same rhythmic chant, now coming from somewhere to my left. Against all better judgment, I moved toward it, drawn by the irrational hope that I might find my friends. What I found instead was another clearing, and in it, another pond. Beside the pond stood Kevin, his back to me, staring into the water. "Kevin!" I hissed, relief flooding through me. "Thank God. We need to get out of here." He didn't respond. As I drew closer, I noticed he was standing unnaturally still, not even seeming to breathe. "Kevin!" I reached out to touch his shoulder. He turned and I stumbled backward with a choked cry. It was Kevin, but not Kevin. His face was the same, but his eyes were gone, replaced by dark, empty sockets that leaked pond water down his cheeks like tears. His skin had the same clay-like quality as the creature's, and when he opened his mouth to speak, water poured out instead of words. I ran. Blindly, desperately, crashing through the swamp without direction or purpose beyond escape. Branches tore at my clothes and skin. Roots seemed to reach up to trip me, and the ground grew increasingly waterlogged, each step sending me ankle-deep into foul-smelling mud. The forest seemed to be closing in around me, cypress and palmetto drawing closer, blocking out what little sunlight penetrated the canopy. The air grew thick with moisture, making each breath a struggle. And always, just behind me, the sound of something moving through the water, something large, something patient. I don't know how long I ran or how far. Time had lost all meaning in that place. At some point, I realized the trees had thinned, and ahead I could see what appeared to be a road or trail. Hope surged through me. Civilization, a way out. I redoubled my effort, ignoring the burning in my lungs and the trembling in my legs. As I broke free from the tree line, I found myself on a narrow dirt road. In the distance, I could make out what looked like a ranger station. Safety. People. Rescue. I staggered forward, nearly sobbing with relief. I was going to make it. I was going to escape this nightmare. Behind me, a familiar voice called my name. Will. I froze, every instinct screaming at me not to turn around, to keep moving toward safety. But I couldn't help myself. Slowly, I looked back. Marcus stood at the edge of the forest, his clothes soaked and muddy, his face pale but intact. No empty eye sockets, no clay-like skin. He looked normal. Human. I found a way out, he said, his voice flat. Through the pond. It's not what we thought, Will. It's beautiful there. Peaceful. Kevin's already there. Something was wrong. His voice, his eyes, the way he stood too perfectly still. Come with me, Marcus continued, extending his hand. You're my friend. I want you to see. As he reached toward me, his sleeve rode up slightly, and I saw it, his wrist where the flesh seemed to be, dissolving, melting away like wet clay to reveal something dark and glistening underneath. Not bone. Something else. I ran. The dirt road stretched before me, the ranger station growing closer with each desperate stride. Behind me, I heard splashing. Something moving fast through water where there should have been only solid ground. I risked a glance over my shoulder and immediately wished I hadn't. The thing that had been Marcus was no longer maintaining its human guise. Its form rippled and flowed like liquid clay, features melting and reforming as it pursued me. And it was gaining. The ranger station was maybe 200 yards ahead now. I could see a truck parked outside, someone moving on the porch. So close. The splashing behind me grew louder, closer. I could feel cold droplets hitting the back of my neck. Water flicked forward by whatever was chasing me. The air filled with that now familiar humming, so loud it seemed to vibrate inside my skull. 100 yards. My lungs were on fire, my legs numb with exhaustion. Something cold and wet wrapped around my ankle. I crashed to the ground, face scraping against the dirt road. I kicked frantically, feeling whatever had grabbed me lose its grip momentarily. Scrambling back to my feet, I saw the ranger station just ahead, a uniformed figure now standing on the porch watching my approach with confusion. "Help!" I screamed, my voice breaking. "Please!" 50 yards. I could make it. I had to make it. Something massive erupted from the ground directly in my path, a geyser of muddy water that coalesced into a vaguely human shape. The swamp walker, C.B. Tate, the thing from the pond. It stood between me and safety, its featureless face somehow radiating malevolence. I skidded to a halt, terror paralyzing me. Behind me, the thing that had been Marcus was closing in. Ahead, the swamp walker blocked my path. I was trapped. The ranger was shouting something, running toward us now, but he seemed impossibly far away, moving in slow motion while the swamp creatures closed in at normal speed. In desperation, I did the only thing I could think of. I lunged sideways, off the road and into the drainage ditch that ran alongside it. It was a gamble. If the ditch connected to the swamp, I was dead. But if it drained toward civilization, I splashed into ankle-deep water and ran, following the ditch away from both creatures. Behind me, I heard an inhuman howl of rage, a sound like rushing water and grinding stones. The ditch curved around a bend, and suddenly the ranger station was visible again, from a different angle. The ranger was now at the edge of the property, shouting and pointing a rifle toward the road where I'd been. With a final surge of desperate energy, I clambered out of the ditch and ran toward him, screaming incoherently. He saw me and swung his rifle in my direction, eyes wide with shock and confusion. I raised my hands, showing I was unarmed, human. "Help me," I gasped as I reached him. "Please, they're coming." The ranger, his nameplate read Morales, grabbed my arm and pulled me toward the station. "What the hell is going on?" he demanded. Who's chasing you?" Before I could answer, a sound like rushing water filled the air. We both turned to see the road where I'd been moments before, now empty. No sign of either creature. But the water in the drainage ditch was rising, rippling in a way that had nothing to do with my passage through it, and it was turning muddy, clay-like. "Inside," Ranger Morales said, pulling me toward the station. "Now." We barely made it through the door before the first surge of water reached the building. Not a natural flow, but a directed wave that slammed against the foundation with deliberate force. The entire structure shuddered. "What the hell?" Morales muttered, bolting the door and reaching for his radio. "This is Ranger Morales at Tate's Hell East Station. We have an emergency situation, possibly flooding. I have a distressed hiker." His voice faded into background noise as I collapsed onto a bench, trembling uncontrollably. Through the window, I could see the water rising around the building, dark and churning, with shapes moving beneath the surface, shapes that occasionally coalesced into almost human forms before dissolving again. They were surrounding us, waiting. I don't remember much of what happened next. Ranger Morales called for backup and evacuation. He tried to get information from me about what had happened, about Kevin and Marcus and Darren. I told him everything, though I could see in his eyes that he didn't believe me. How could he? It sounded insane. Backup arrived 2 hours later, not in trucks but in airboats because by then the water had risen so high that the ranger station was effectively an island in a newly formed swamp. They had to break a window to get us out because the door was blocked by debris that hadn't been there before. Logs and branches that pressed against the building with purposeful pressure. As we sped away in the airboat, I looked back at the ranger station. In its shadow, standing just at the edge of visibility, was a tall, thin figure made of clay and water. It raised one impossibly long arm in what might have been a farewell, or perhaps a promise. We never found Kevin, Marcus, or Darren. The official report listed them as missing, presumed drowned in a flash flood that inexplicably affected only that small section of Tate's Hell State Forest. The rangers found our campsite submerged under 10 feet of water, with no sign of our equipment or any personal belongings. I tried to tell them what really happened. I described the swamp walker, the disappearances, the transformations. I begged them to drain the pond, to search more thoroughly. They nodded politely and recommended I speak to a trauma counselor. Eventually, I stopped talking about it. What was the point? No one believed me. I moved away from Florida, far from any swamps or forests. I live in Arizona now, in the desert where water is scarce and precious and very, very visible. But sometimes, when it rains, a rare occurrence here, I find myself staring at puddles with mounting dread, watching for ripples that move against the flow, listening for a familiar humming that rises underneath the sound of falling water. And sometimes, when I can't avoid sleep any longer, I dream of Kevin and Marcus and Darren. My name is William Brown, and I am 32 years old. This happened in the Apalachicola National Forest, just outside of Tallahassee, Florida, 3 years ago. I still dream about it every night. I'd always been the outdoorsy type. Growing up in suburban Jacksonville, I'd spend every weekend I could camping, hiking, or kayaking. When I finally saved enough to quit my suffocating office job and pursue my dream of hiking the Florida Trail, my friends thought I was insane. "Who leaves a stable career to wander around in the woods?" they'd asked. But after my divorce from Melissa, I needed something drastic, something to remind me I was still alive. The Florida Trail isn't as famous as the Appalachian or Pacific Crest, but it stretches over 1,500 miles from Big Cypress National Preserve to Gulf Islands National Seashore. I'd planned to hike the entire thing, taking my time documenting the journey for a blog I hoped might turn into a guidebook someday, something to rebuild my life around. My first week went perfectly. The weather cooperated, my gear performed well, and the solitude was exactly what I needed. I'd spent most of my time in the southern portions, enjoying the unique ecosystem of the Everglades. But as I made my way north, I began to feel a strange unease I couldn't explain. It started when I reached the Apalachicola section. The forest there is different, older somehow, with towering longleaf pines and dense undergrowth that seems to swallow sound. On my third day in Apalachicola, I met Marcus. I'd stopped at a small clearing beside Mud Swamp to refill my water bottles when I noticed him watching me from between the trees. He was tall and gaunt, maybe 60 years old, with a weathered face and clothes that had seen better days. Not unusual for a backwoods Floridian, but something about his stillness made the hair on my neck stand up. "You're on the wrong trail," he called out, not moving from his spot. I straightened up, trying to appear casual despite my racing heart. "I'm hiking the Florida Trail. According to my map, I'm right where I should be." He stepped into the clearing, and I noticed he carried no pack, no water bottle, nothing you'd expect from someone this deep in the forest. Maps don't mean much in these parts. Some places aren't meant to be mapped. I'd met my share of eccentric locals on hikes before, so I smiled politely. "I appreciate the concern, but I've got a GPS and plenty of supplies." Marcus didn't smile back. "GPS won't help when you reach the hollow. Devices don't work there. Nothing works there like it should." He gestured northward. 2 miles that way, you'll see a split in the trail. Official path goes east. Don't take the western fork." "Why not? Is it dangerous?" I asked, curiosity overriding my initial wariness. "Tate Hollow wasn't always part of this forest," Marcus said, his voice dropping. "Land got added in the 50s when nobody would buy it. The Tate family disappeared there in 1925. All 8 of them. House was empty, table set for dinner, but they were gone. Some say they found things in the woods, old things that should have stayed buried." I nodded, pretending to take his warning seriously while mentally filing it under local color for my blog. "I'll stick to the marked trail." "See that you do." He turned to leave, then paused. "And if you hear singing at night, cover your ears and don't look, no matter how beautiful it sounds." Before I could ask what he meant, he disappeared into the dense undergrowth as silently as he'd appeared. That night, camped beside a small tributary of the Ochlockonee River, I replayed our conversation while tending my fire. Florida has its share of local legends and ghost stories. Every state does. But something about Marcus's warning lingered uncomfortably in my mind. I checked my map and sure enough spotted the fork he'd mentioned. The official trail curved eastward while an unmarked path continued west, toward something labeled simply as private property. My rational mind said to ignore the warning and stick to my planned route. But another part of me, the part that had quit his job to wander the wilderness, wondered what lay down that forbidden path. What if there was some spectacular view or unique geological feature I'd miss? As a travel writer in the making, wasn't it my job to explore the road less traveled? I fell asleep, weighing the decision, the fire dying to embers beside me. A sound woke me sometime after midnight, a haunting melody drifting through the trees. It was faint but unmistakably human, a woman's voice singing words I couldn't quite make out. The melody was unlike anything I'd heard before, somehow both ancient and intimately familiar, as if it were calling to something deep within me. Marcus's warning flashed through my mind. "If you hear singing at night, cover your ears and don't look." But the voice was so beautiful, so alluring, I found myself unzipping my tent before I'd consciously decided to move. The forest outside was bathed in pale moonlight, shadows stretching like fingers between the trees. The singing seemed to come from the direction I'd be heading tomorrow, toward that fork in the trail. I stood motionless, listening, trying to untangle the words woven through the melody. Something rustled in the undergrowth nearby. I swung my flashlight toward the sound and caught a glimpse of movement, something large slipping behind a tree. My heart pounded as I swept the beam in an arc, searching. "Hello," I called, immediately regretting breaking the silence. The singing stopped abruptly. The forest grew unnaturally quiet. No insects, no nightbirds, nothing. Just my own breathing and the pounding of blood in my ears. I backed slowly toward my tent, eyes straining against the darkness. As I reached the entrance, I heard it. A soft, deliberate footstep on the leaf litter behind me. I whirled around, flashlight beam cutting through the night, but saw nothing. Sleep was impossible after that. I lay awake until dawn, knife in hand, listening to the occasional snap of twigs outside my tent. When the first gray light filtered through the nylon, I packed quickly and hit the trail, eager to put distance between myself and whatever had visited my campsite. By midday, I reached the fork Marcus had warned me about. The main trail was clearly marked with the orange blazes of the Florida Trail, curving eastward as expected. The western path was overgrown, barely visible except for a narrow gap in the vegetation. No signs, no markings, just as Marcus had described. I stood there longer than I cared to admit, staring down that forbidden path. The rational part of my brain screamed to follow the main trail, but I couldn't shake the memory of that haunting melody. What if the singer was someone in trouble? What if the hollow held answers to the questions now burning in my mind? I checked my GPS to mark my position, planning to explore just a little way down the western path before returning. To my surprise, the screen showed only static. I tried my phone next. No signal, which wasn't unusual, but the compass app also failed to load. A chill ran through me as Marcus's words echoed in my head. Devices don't work there. Common sense said to continue east on the marked trail. Instead, I adjusted my pack and stepped onto the overgrown western path. The change was almost immediate. The forest around the unofficial trail seemed darker, the trees growing closer together, their canopies blocking most of the sunlight. The air felt heavier, thick with the smell of rotting vegetation and something else, something musty and ancient. The normal sounds of the forest, birdsong, insects, the rustle of small animals, faded until each step I took seemed unnaturally loud in the silence. After about 30 minutes of increasingly difficult hiking, the path opened onto what must have been Tate Hollow. It wasn't what I expected. Rather than a dark, forbidding place, I found myself in a surprisingly beautiful clearing. Wildflowers dotted the tall grass, and at the center stood the remains of what had once been a substantial homestead. The main house was little more than a stone foundation and chimney now, but several outbuildings were still partially intact. I approached cautiously, camera in hand, thinking that whatever else this expedition yielded, the abandoned homestead would make for interesting blog content. The largest of the remaining structures appeared to be a barn, its roof partially collapsed but its walls still standing. Next to it was a small family cemetery, perhaps a dozen weathered headstones arranged in neat rows behind a rusted iron fence. As I drew closer to the graves, I noticed something odd. Most of the headstones showed dates from the late 1800s to early 1900s, all bearing the Tate name, but one plot appeared freshly dug. No headstone marked it, just a mound of dark earth that couldn't have been more than a few days old. The sight of that fresh grave sent a wave of unease through me. Who would be burying people in an abandoned family plot in the middle of nowhere? I thought of Marcus and wondered if he was responsible, if this was some kind of backwoods burial ground still in use by locals who respected the old ways. I was contemplating this when I noticed the sun's position. Somehow, hours had passed since I'd left the main trail, though it felt like less than one. I needed to make a decision, set up camp here in the hollow, or try to make it back to the main trail before dark. The smart choice was obvious. Despite the beauty of the meadow, everything about this place set my nerves on edge. I turned to leave, and froze. A young woman stood at the edge of the clearing, partially hidden by the shadow of a massive oak. She wore a simple white dress that seemed out of place in the wilderness, and her dark hair hung loose around a face that was striking in its pallor. She wasn't looking at me, but rather at the house foundations, her expression one of profound sadness. "Hello there," I called, keeping my distance. I didn't mean to trespass. She turned slowly, seeming unsurprised by my presence. Her eyes, when they met mine, were a startling shade of amber that almost appeared to glow in the shadows. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice soft but carrying clearly across the clearing. It was the same voice I'd heard singing the night before. I was certain of it. "Are you from around here?" I asked, taking a step toward her. "Do you know about the Tate family?" A sad smile touched her lips. "I know everything about them." "My name's William," I said. "I'm hiking the Florida Trail, just took a detour to explore." "Eliza," she replied simply. She looked up at the darkening sky. "Night comes quickly in the hollow. You should go." I glanced at the sun, now sinking rapidly toward the tree line. "I'm not sure I can make it back to the main trail before dark. Is there somewhere safe to camp nearby?" Eliza's expression changed, a flash of what looked like fear crossing her features. "Not here. Never here." She pointed to a narrow path leading north, different from the one I'd arrived on. "Follow that path for 20 minutes. You'll find a stream with a large oak fallen across it. You can camp there safely." "Why not here?" I asked, gesturing to the pleasant meadow. "Seems perfect for camping." "They come back at night," she whispered. "The Tates. They're still looking for what was taken from them." A chill ran down my spine despite the warm afternoon. "You mean the family that disappeared in 1925? That's just a story." Eliza's amber eyes seemed to darken. "All stories have truth at their core, William. Please, go now. Reach the oak before sunset." Before I could ask anything else, she turned and walked into the forest, quickly disappearing among the trees. I stood there for a moment, processing our strange conversation. Part of me wanted to follow her, to demand more answers, but something in her urgency convinced me to heed her advice. I hurried along the path she'd indicated, pushing through the increasingly dense undergrowth as the light faded around me. True to Eliza's word, after about 20 minutes of brisk hiking, I came upon a clear stream with a massive fallen oak creating a natural bridge across it. The area around the tree was relatively flat and clear of underbrush, a decent campsite by any standard. I set up my tent and prepared a cold dinner, not wanting to risk a fire that might attract attention. As darkness fell completely, the forest came alive with sounds, but not the normal chorus of frogs and insects I'd become accustomed to. These sounds were subtler, more deliberate, soft footfalls circling my campsite, whispered conversations just beyond the range of comprehension, occasional laughter that raised the hair on my arms. I sat motionless in my tent, knife in one hand, flashlight in the other, listening to the nocturnal activity around me. Occasionally, my light would catch movement at the edge of its beam, a flicker of white that might have been Eliza's dress or something else entirely. Sleep was impossible. I dozed fitfully, jerking awake at every unusual sound. Shortly before dawn, the whispers and movements finally ceased, and I fell into an exhausted slumber. I woke to bright sunlight and a presence outside my tent. Heart racing, I unzipped the door to find Eliza sitting calmly beside the stream, watching me. "You stayed," she said simply, "as you suggested." I emerged from the tent, stiff and unrested. "What were those sounds last night? I kept hearing voices, movements." "The hollow has many residents," she replied cryptically. "Most mean no harm, but they're curious about visitors." I studied her in the daylight. She was younger than I'd first thought, perhaps mid-20s, with a delicate beauty that seemed somehow timeless. Her white dress was spotless despite our wilderness surroundings, and she wore no shoes, her bare feet somehow unmarked by the rough forest floor. "You're not just a local, are you?" I asked directly. "How do you know about the Tates? About this place?" Eliza was silent for a long moment, trailing her fingers through the clear stream water. "I was born here," she finally said. "My full name is Eliza Jane Tate." I stared at her, mind reeling. "That's impossible. The Tates disappeared almost 100 years ago." "Not disappeared," she corrected gently. "Taken. There's a difference." "Taken by whom?" Her amber eyes met mine. By what lives beneath the hollow? The thing my grandfather discovered while digging the new well in 1925. She looked away toward the direction of the homestead. He thought he'd found a cave system, maybe even treasure. What he found was much older, much hungrier. The rational part of my mind argued that this was elaborate local folklore, or perhaps I was speaking to a mentally ill woman who believed herself to be a long-dead settler. But another part, the part that had heard the whispers in the night, wasn't so certain. If you're really Eliza Tate, how are you here now, looking like this? I gestured to her youthful appearance. Time works differently in the hollow, she said, especially for those it claims. I age only when I leave, so I stay most days. She stood abruptly. But we've talked enough. You need to leave today, William. Return to the main trail and continue your journey. What about you? I asked, surprised by my own concern for this strange woman. This is my home, she said simply. I watch over it, and I warn those who wander too close. It's the least I can do. Warn them about what, exactly? Eliza's expression darkened. About the hunger beneath the hollow. It sleeps most of the time now. But when someone wanders in, especially someone alone, it stirs. It collects people, William, adds them to itself. My family has been part of it for almost a century. I felt sick, unable to reconcile her calm demeanor with the horror she described. And the fresh grave I saw. Marcus Jenkins, she said softly. He's watched over this place for 40 years, keeping hikers away when he could. 3 days ago, he failed to turn back a pair of college students. What happened to them? The thing beneath the hollow took them, and when Marcus tried to help, she trailed off, leaving the implication clear. My blood ran cold as I remembered my encounter with Marcus. That's impossible. I spoke with Marcus 2 days ago, near Mud Swamp. Eliza's eyes widened. No, Marcus is dead. I helped bury him myself. Tall man, weathered face, warned me about the Western Fork and about singing at night. She nodded slowly, her face growing even paler. That wasn't Marcus. William. The hollow, sometimes. Wears people it's taken, uses them to lure others. My mind raced, trying to process what she was saying. If the Marcus I'd met wasn't really Marcus, then what, or who, had directed me to this place? I need to leave, I said, suddenly desperate to be anywhere but here. I began hastily breaking down my campsite, shoving equipment haphazardly into my pack. Yes, Eliza agreed, watching me with those unsettling amber eyes. But not the way you came. That path leads only to the hollow now. You must cross the stream and follow it eastward. Eventually, you'll rejoin the main trail. I shouldered my now bulging pack. Come with me, I urged. You don't have to stay here. She smiled sadly. I told you, I age outside the hollow. The moment I cross that stream, 98 years will catch up with me. Besides, someone has to warn the others who stray this way. Like Marcus did? Like Marcus did, she confirmed. Though I fear whatever is wearing his face has other plans for travelers now. I wanted to argue further, to somehow convince this strange woman to leave this haunted place, but the growing sense of dread in my gut urged me onward. I thanked her, crossed the fallen oak and began following the stream as she'd instructed, looking back only once. Eliza stood watching me, a solitary figure in white against the dark forest. She raised her hand in farewell, then turned and walked back toward the hollow, fading into the trees like morning mist. The journey back to the main trail was arduous but uneventful. After several hours of following the stream, I spotted the familiar orange blazes of the Florida Trail and nearly wept with relief. My GPS and phone began working again the moment I rejoined the marked path. I continued my hike northward, completing the entire Florida Trail over the next 2 months. I told myself that my experience in Tate Hollow had been some combination of dehydration, exhaustion, and suggestion. that Eliza was just an eccentric local playing games with a gullible hiker, but deep down, I knew different. The nightmares that followed me home told a different story. Dreams of amber eyes watching from the trees, of whispered voices calling my name, of something ancient and hungry stirring beneath the Florida soil. I've never returned to Apalachicola National Forest. My blog and guidebook focus on other trails, other wilderness areas, places where the separation between past and present, between living and dead, feels more certain. But sometimes on quiet nights when I'm camping far from home, I hear singing in the darkness, a hauntingly beautiful melody that seems to call me back to a clearing in the Florida pines, to a hollow where time bends and hungry things wait beneath the earth. And I wonder if, one day, I'll answer that call. If I'll find myself walking down an unmarked western path toward a reunion with Eliza Jane Tate and whatever family waits with her in the hollow. I wonder if, perhaps, I was always meant to.